Hello dear friends, and welcome to Sacred Slumber. Before we begin this beautiful journey together, I'd love to connect with you for just a moment. How has your day been? Whether it's morning, afternoon or evening where you are in the world, I hope this story finds you in a peaceful place, ready to receive some comfort and inspiration. No matter what corner of the globe you're listening from, you're part of our Sacred Slumber family. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to Sacred Slumber for more stories like this one that will nourish your soul and bring peace to your heart. Tonight, we're going to journey together through one of the most remarkable stories ever told, the true account of Joseph, a young man whose life teaches us profound lessons about resilience, faith, and the mysterious ways that purpose unfolds even in our darkest moments. This is a story that has inspired millions across centuries, reminding us that no matter how deep our pit may seem, there's always hope for palace moments ahead. In the ancient land of Canaan, where the sun painted golden hues across rolling hills dotted with olive trees and grazing flocks, there lived a patriarch named Jacob. His tents were pitched near Hebron, and his wealth was measured not in gold or silver, but in the size of his herds and the strength of his family. Jacob had 12 sons, but among them all one held a special place in his father's heart. Joseph was 17 years old, with eyes that sparkled with intelligence and a spirit that seemed to dance with dreams. He was the son of Rachel, Jacob's but loved wife, who had died giving birth to Benjamin, Joseph's younger brother. Perhaps it was the memory of Rachel that made Jacob's love for Joseph burn so brightly, or perhaps it was something else, a recognition of the extraordinary destiny that seemed to hover around this particular son like morning mist around a mountain peak. The favouritism was evident to everyone in the household. While Joseph's older brothers, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar and Zebulun worked hard in the fields tending the flocks, Joseph often remained close to home. His brothers wore the simple, practical garments of shepherds, but Joseph wore something entirely different. One day Jacob called Joseph to his tent. The old man's hands, weathered by years of labour and life, held a garment that took Joseph's breath away. It was a coat of many colours, rich blues like the depths of the sea, vibrant reds like the sunset over the desert, brilliant yellows like fields of grain, and deep purples like the robes of kings. The fabric was fine, the workmanship exquisite. It was not the coat of a shepherd, but the robe of a prince. "My son," Jacob said, his voice thick with emotion as he placed the coat on Joseph's shoulders, "this is for you. You are precious to me beyond measure." Joseph felt the weight of the coat, but more than that, he felt the weight of his father's love and the unspoken promise it contained. As he walked among his brothers wearing this magnificent garment, he could feel their eyes following him, eyes that had grown cold with resentment and hard with jealousy. But the coat was only the beginning. Joseph had always been a dreamer, but now his dreams took on a quality that was both wonderful and troubling. One morning, as the family gathered for their meal, Joseph could no longer contain the vision that had visited him in the night. "Listen to this dream I had," Joseph said, his voice bright with excitement and innocence. "We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field, when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." The silence that followed was deafening. His brothers exchanged glances that spoke volumes. Reuben's jaw tightened. Simeon's hands clenched into fists. Judah shook his head in disgust. "Do you intend to reign over us?" Simeon asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Will you actually rule us?" But Joseph, in his youthful enthusiasm, seemed oblivious to the storm clouds gathering around him. Soon after he had another dream, even more vivid than the first. "Listen," he said one evening as the family sat around the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on their faces. "I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." Even Jacob was troubled by this dream. "What is this dream you had?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of concern. "Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" Though Jacob rebuked Joseph publicly, privately he pondered these words in his heart. There was something about his son's dreams that felt different from ordinary night visions. They carried the weight of prophecy, the sense of divine purpose. But for Joseph's brothers, these dreams were the final straw. Their hatred for Joseph grew like a cancer, fed by jealousy and watered by resentment. The brothers could hardly speak a civil word to Joseph anymore. When he approached, conversation stopped. When he tried to join their work, they found reasons to send him away. The coat of many colours became a symbol of everything they despised about their father's favouritism and their brother's apparent arrogance. One day, Jacob sent Joseph to check on his brothers who were grazing the flocks near Dothan, several days' journey from home. As Joseph set out, wearing his beautiful coat and carrying provisions for his brothers, he had no idea that he was walking toward a destiny that would change not only his life, but the course of history itself. The brothers saw him coming from a long distance, the colours of his coat visible even across the rolling hills. As that familiar figure approached, the resentment that had been building for years finally reached its boiling point. "Here comes that dreamer," one of them said with venom. "Let's kill him," another suggested. "We can throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." For a moment, murder hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. But Reuben, the eldest, felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. "Let's not take his life," he said quickly. "Throw him into this cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him." Privately, Reuben planned to rescue Joseph later and return him to their father. When Joseph finally reached his brothers, he greeted them with a smile, completely unaware of the dark thoughts that had been brewing in their hearts. But instead of the warm welcome he expected, they seized him roughly. Hands that should have embraced him tore at his beautiful coat, stripping it from his body. Before he could fully comprehend what was happening, they had grabbed him and thrown him into an empty cistern. The pit was deep and dry, its walls smooth stone that offered no hope of escape. As Joseph hit the bottom, the breath knocked from his lungs. He looked up to see the circle of sky above growing smaller as his brothers walked away. The silence was overwhelming. One moment he had been walking free under the open sky, and the next he was trapped in a hole in the ground, abandoned by his own family. Above him, his brothers sat down to eat their meal as if nothing had happened. The casual way they consumed their bread and cheese while their brother suffered below spoke volumes about how completely their hearts had been hardened by jealousy. But God's purposes are rarely thwarted by human cruelty. And even as Joseph sat in that pit, wondering if he would die there, divine providence was already at work. In the distance, a caravan of Ishmaelite traders appeared on the horizon, their camels loaded with spices, balm and myrrh bound for Egypt. Judah, perhaps feeling some stirring of conscience, looked at his brothers and said, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." The brothers agreed, seeing an opportunity to rid themselves of Joseph while making a profit. They pulled Joseph out of the cistern and sold him to the traders for 20 shekels of silver. As the caravan disappeared into the distance with Joseph bound among the slaves, the brothers took his coat of many colours and tore it. Then they killed a goat and dipped the coat in its blood. When they returned home, they presented the bloodied coat to their father. "We found this," they said. "Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe." Jacob recognized it immediately. The colours that had once brought him such joy now brought only anguish. "It is my son's robe," he cried. "Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Jacob tore his clothes in grief and put on sackcloth. He mourned for his son many days, and though all his sons and daughters came to comfort him, he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." Meanwhile, the caravan carrying Joseph continued its journey toward Egypt, each step taking him further from everything he had ever known and loved. As the young man looked back at the fading hills of his homeland, he could not have imagined that this betrayal, this moment that felt like the end of everything, was actually the beginning of a story that would demonstrate the power of God to bring beauty from ashes and purpose from pain. The journey to Egypt was long and grueling. Joseph, who had never known anything but comfort and privilege, now found himself chained among slaves, his feet bloody from walking across rough terrain, his throat parched from the desert sun. The traders were not cruel, but neither were they kind. He was simply merchandise to them, a commodity to be delivered in good condition to fetch the best price. As the caravan crested the final hill before entering Egypt, Joseph's eyes widened at the sight before him. Egypt was unlike anything he had ever seen. The Nile River stretched like a blue ribbon through the landscape, its banks lined with lush green vegetation that stood in stark contrast to the golden desert beyond. Pyramids rose majestically in the distance, monuments to the power and sophistication of this ancient civilization. The cities teemed with activity, merchants hawking their wares, craftsmen plying their trades, and everywhere the bustle of a society that had mastered the art of turning the desert into a garden. In the slave market of Memphis, Joseph stood with the others as potential buyers examined them like livestock. His youth and obvious intelligence caught the eye of several bidders, but it was Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard, who ultimately purchased him. Potiphar was a man of considerable wealth and influence, with a household that required numerous servants to maintain its operations. Joseph's new life began in Potiphar's house, where he was assigned to work among the other servants. Everything about his circumstances had changed. He who had once worn a coat of many colours now dressed in the simple linen of a slave. He who had once been served was now serving others. He who had once been the favoured son was now property, with no rights and no freedom. But something remarkable happened in Potiphar's house. Instead of becoming bitter or despondent, Joseph chose to serve with excellence. When he was given a task, he completed it better than anyone expected. When he was assigned to care for something, he treated it as if it were his own. His attitude was not that of a man who'd been wronged, but of someone who understood that his character was more important than his circumstances. It didn't take long for Potiphar to notice this exceptional young man. While other servants did only what was required of them, Joseph anticipated needs before they were expressed. He learned the Egyptian language with remarkable speed, mastered the customs of the household, and demonstrated an administrative ability that was far beyond his years. Most importantly, there was something about Joseph's presence that seemed to bring blessing wherever he went. Potiphar began to entrust Joseph with greater responsibilities. First, he made him his personal attendant. Then he put him in charge of his household affairs. Before long, Joseph was managing all of Potiphar's possessions, his property, his servants, his business dealings. The Egyptian captain of the guard had never seen anything like it. Everything that Joseph touched seemed to prosper. Years passed, and Joseph grew from a teenager into a handsome young man. The hardships he had endured had not broken him, but had instead forged him into someone of remarkable character and capability. Potiphar trusted him completely, to the point where he concerned himself with nothing except the food he ate. Everything else was in Joseph's capable hands. But success and favour can sometimes bring their own dangers, and Joseph was about to face a test that would prove even more challenging than the pit his brothers had thrown him into. Potiphar's wife had noticed the young Hebrew slave who had risen to such prominence in her household. Joseph was not only capable and trustworthy, but he had grown into a man of striking appearance. Day after day she watched him as he went about his duties with quiet dignity and remarkable competence. Soon, watching was not enough. "Come to bed with me," she said to Joseph one day when they found themselves alone. Joseph was stunned by her proposition. The wife of his master, a woman of rank and privilege, was propositioning a slave. But Joseph's response revealed the depth of his character and the strength of his convictions. "No," he said firmly but respectfully. "With me in charge, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" Day after day she spoke to Joseph, but he refused to go to bed with her or even to be with her. Joseph understood that betraying Potiphar's trust would not only be wrong, but it would also be a sin against the God who had been with him through all his trials. His integrity was not for sale, regardless of the price or the pressure. But a person determined to do wrong will often become vindictive when their advances are rejected. Potiphar's wife's desire turned to anger, and her anger to a determination for revenge. She waited for the right opportunity, and one day when Joseph came into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants were inside, she made her move. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But Joseph left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. Holding his cloak as evidence, Potiphar's wife called to the household servants. "Look," she said, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. When Potiphar came home, his wife told him the same story. That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me, but as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." Potiphar burned with anger. The man he had trusted above all others, the servant who had brought such blessing to his household, had apparently betrayed that trust in the worst possible way. Without investigation, without hearing Joseph's side of the story, Potiphar had Joseph seized and thrown into prison, the same prison where the king's prisoners were confined. Once again, Joseph found himself in a pit, though this time it was made of stone and iron rather than earth. Once again, he had been betrayed by those he had served faithfully. Once again, his circumstances had changed dramatically through no fault of his own. He had done the right thing, had maintained his integrity, had honoured God, and his reward was imprisonment for a crime he had not committed. Many people would have become bitter at this point. They would have questioned why God allowed such injustice, why faithfulness seemed to be rewarded with suffering. They might have decided that integrity was not worth the cost, that doing right was foolish when it led to such consequences. But Joseph was not like most people. Even in prison, even after being falsely accused and unjustly punished, something within him refused to give up hope. He had learned that his circumstances did not define him, his character did. He had discovered that God's presence was not dependent on favourable conditions, but was available even in the darkest places. And remarkably, even in prison, Joseph began to prosper. The warden noticed this unusual prisoner who carried himself with such dignity, who treated others with such respect, who seemed to bring order and blessing wherever he went. Before long, the warden put Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners and made him responsible for all that was done in the prison. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. Once again, Joseph had taken a situation that seemed hopeless and had found a way to serve with excellence, to lead with integrity, and to trust that somehow, in ways he could not yet see, God was working all things together for good. But the greatest tests of Joseph's faith were still ahead, and the prison that seemed like an ending was actually preparing him for a beginning that would astonish the world. Prison has a way of stripping away everything except what truly matters. In the Egyptian jail where Joseph now found himself, surrounded by stone walls and iron bars, the external trappings of success and status meant nothing. Here, in this place reserved for those who had supposedly committed crimes against Pharaoh, Joseph faced the ultimate test of his character. Days turned into months, and months into years. Joseph had now spent more time as a slave and prisoner than he had as the favoured son in his father's house. The dreams of his youth, the sheaves bowing down, the sun and moon and stars paying homage, seemed like the fantasies of another lifetime. If someone had asked him during those long, dark nights whether he still believed in those dreams, he might have wondered himself. But Joseph had learned something profound during his years of hardship, that faith is not about understanding God's timeline, but about trusting God's character. He had seen evidence of divine favour even in the darkest circumstances. When he was in Potiphar's house, God had blessed his work. Now, even in prison, he could see the same pattern. Blessing flowing through him to benefit others. Success following him, even in the most unlikely places. The other prisoners noticed something different about Joseph. While many of them spent their time in despair, anger, or plotting revenge, Joseph maintained a remarkable sense of peace. He listened to their stories with compassion, helped resolve disputes with wisdom, and carried himself with a dignity that prison walls could not diminish. The warden had made him the unofficial leader among the prisoners, and everyone, guards and inmates alike, respected him. One morning, Joseph noticed that 2 of his fellow prisoners seemed particularly troubled. They were not ordinary criminals, but former members of Pharaoh's household, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. Both had been imprisoned for offences against their royal master, and both carried themselves with the dignity of men, accustomed to positions of privilege and responsibility. "Why do you look so sad today?" Joseph asked them. The cupbearer answered, "We both had dreams, but there is no one to interpret them." In the ancient world, dreams were considered messages from the gods, and their interpretation was a specialized skill typically reserved for trained priests and wise men. To have a significant dream and no way to understand its meaning was a source of genuine distress. Joseph's response revealed both his humility and his faith. "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." The chief cupbearer went first. "In my dream," he said, "I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand." Joseph listened carefully, and as the cupbearer spoke, understanding came to him with a clarity that felt like sunrise after a long night. "This is what it means," Joseph said. "The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer." The cupbearer's face lit up with hope. Joseph continued, "But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon." When the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favourable interpretation to the cupbearer's dream, he eagerly shared his own vision. "I too had a dream," he said. "On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head." Joseph's expression grew grave as he received understanding of this dream as well. The interpretation was not pleasant, but Joseph knew he had to speak the truth. "This is what it means," he said gently. "The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body on a pole, and the birds will eat away your flesh." 3 days later, it was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, so that he once again put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he impaled the chief baker, just as Joseph had said to them in his interpretation. The accuracy of Joseph's interpretation should have marked him as a man of extraordinary ability, someone worthy of attention and favour. The chief cupbearer had been restored to his position of influence, with direct access to the most powerful man in Egypt. Surely he would remember the prisoner who had correctly interpreted his dream and had specifically asked to be remembered. But the chief cupbearer forgot about Joseph. This forgetting was perhaps one of the most difficult trials Joseph had yet faced. It was not the active betrayal of his brothers or the false accusation of Potiphar's wife, but the passive neglect of someone who simply failed to keep his word. Day after day, Joseph waited, hoping that this would be the day when guards would come to release him, when word would arrive that Pharaoh wanted to see him. But the days passed in silence. Months turned into a year, and then another year. 2 full years passed, and still the cupbearer, busy with his restored duties and privileges, did not remember the Hebrew slave who had correctly interpreted his dream. It was as if Joseph had been forgotten not just by one man, but by the entire world. During these 2 years of waiting, Joseph could have become bitter. He could have concluded that helping others was pointless, that kindness was wasted on those who would not return it. He could have decided that his gift for interpreting dreams was worthless if it could not even secure his own freedom. Many people would have given up hope entirely. But Joseph continued to trust, continued to serve, continued to maintain his character even when it seemed to bring no reward. He understood something that many people never learn, that our calling is to be faithful, not to control outcomes. His job was to use his gifts with integrity and kindness. God's job was to handle the timing and the results. In the darkness of those 2 forgotten years, Joseph's faith was refined like gold in a furnace. The dreams of his youth were still alive within him, but they had been purified of any pride or presumption. He was learning that God's promises are always fulfilled, but rarely on our timeline or in the way we expect. And unbeknownst to Joseph, his time of preparation was nearly complete. All the lessons he had learned, about integrity under pressure, about leadership in difficult circumstances, about maintaining faith when it seemed unrewarded, were about to be put to their ultimate test. The pit had prepared him for the palace, but first he would need to prove that he was ready for both the privilege and the responsibility that awaited him. The stage was being set for one of the most dramatic turnarounds in human history, and the forgotten prisoner was about to become the second most powerful man in the greatest empire on earth. Pharaoh stood on the balcony of his palace, looking out over the magnificent kingdom that stretched as far as the eye could see. The Nile flowed majestically past the royal residence, its waters reflecting the first light of dawn. Egypt was at the height of its power and prosperity, with abundant harvests, thriving trade, and monuments that would stand for millennia as testaments to its greatness. But on this particular morning, Pharaoh was deeply troubled. For 2 nights in a row, he had been visited by dreams so vivid and disturbing that they left him unable to rest. These were not ordinary dreams. They carried the weight of divine communication, the sense that the gods were trying to tell him something of vital importance. But what? The first dream had been strange and unsettling. Pharaoh had dreamed he was standing by the Nile when 7 cows, fat and sleek, came up out of the river and began grazing among the reeds. Then 7 other cows came up out of the river after them, but these were ugly and gaunt, more wasted and emaciated than any cattle Pharaoh had ever seen in all of Egypt. The ugly, gaunt cows ate up the 7 fat, sleek cows, but even after eating them they looked just as ugly and gaunt as before. The second dream was equally mysterious. This time Pharaoh saw 7 heads of grain growing on a single stalk, healthy and good. Then 7 other heads sprouted after them, but these were thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy full heads. Pharaoh woke from each dream with a sense of foreboding that he could not shake. These dreams meant something, but what? He immediately called for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt, men who were trained in the ancient arts of dream interpretation and divine communication. They came quickly at their king's summons, eager to demonstrate their wisdom and earn royal favour. But as Pharaoh recounted his dreams to them, something unprecedented happened. These men, who had built their reputations on their ability to interpret dreams and divine the will of the gods, were completely baffled. They offered various theories and possibilities, but none of them carried the ring of truth. Pharaoh could sense their uncertainty, their fumbling attempts to provide answers they simply did not have. It was in this moment of royal frustration and growing anxiety that the chief cupbearer suddenly remembered something, or rather someone, he had forgotten for 2 long years. "Today I'm reminded of my shortcomings," the cupbearer said, approaching Pharaoh with obvious embarrassment. "Pharaoh was once angry with his servants, and he imprisoned me and the chief baker in the house of the captain of the guard. Each of us had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. Now a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he interpreted them for us, giving each man the interpretation of his dream, and things turned out exactly as he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, and the other man was impaled." Pharaoh's eyes sharpened with interest. A Hebrew slave who could interpret dreams with perfect accuracy, when his own wise men were stumped. "Send for him immediately," Pharaoh commanded. Guards rushed to the prison and found Joseph. "Pharaoh wants to see you," they announced. "Quickly, make yourself presentable." Joseph could hardly believe what he was hearing. After more than a decade in Egypt, first as a slave, then as a prisoner, He was suddenly being summoned to appear before the most powerful man on earth. He shaved, changed his clothes, and tried to prepare himself mentally for whatever was about to happen. As Joseph was led into the royal presence, he could not help but be awed by the magnificence that surrounded him. The palace was a testament to Egypt's wealth and sophistication, with soaring columns, intricate carvings, and precious metals gleaming everywhere. Pharaoh himself sat on a throne that seemed to embody the power and mystery of the gods, dressed in robes that spoke of unimaginable authority. "I had a dream," Pharaoh said without preamble, "and no one can interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream you can interpret it." Joseph's response revealed the humility and faith that had sustained him through all his trials. "I cannot do it," Joseph replied, "but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires." This was a remarkable statement for several reasons. First, Joseph gave no credit to himself, acknowledging that any ability he had came from God. Second, he was confident that God would provide the interpretation, even though he had not yet heard the dreams. Third, he was willing to stand before the most powerful man on earth and speak about his Hebrew God, a courageous act that could have had serious consequences if Pharaoh had taken offense. Pharaoh proceeded to tell Joseph both of his dreams in detail, describing the fat and gaunt cows, the healthy and withered grain. As he spoke, Joseph listened with the same careful attention he had given to the dreams of his fellow prisoners years earlier. When Pharaoh finished, Joseph spoke with clarity and confidence that amazed everyone present. "The dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same," he said. "God has revealed to Pharaoh what he's about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It is one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterward are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine." Joseph continued, his voice carrying the authority of divine revelation. "It is just as I said to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he's about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered, because the famine that follows it will be so severe. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon." But Joseph did not stop with the interpretation. Drawing on his years of experience in administration and his natural wisdom, he offered practical advice for dealing with the crisis that was coming. "And now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh, to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in reserve for the country, to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine." The plan was brilliant in its simplicity and scope. During the 7 years of abundance, Egypt would systematically store 1/5 of each harvest. This would require massive organisational skills, enormous storage facilities, and careful distribution networks. It would be one of the most ambitious administrative undertakings in human history. Pharaoh and his officials were amazed not only by the interpretation, which had the unmistakable ring of truth, but also by the comprehensive plan Joseph had outlined. Here was a man who could not only understand divine communication, but could also translate that understanding into practical action. "Can we find anyone like this man?" Pharaoh asked his officials. "One in whom is the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." And so, in a single day, Joseph went from being a forgotten prisoner to being the 2nd most powerful man in Egypt. Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and people shouted before him, "Make way!" Pharaoh also gave Joseph an Egyptian name, Zaphanath-Paneah, and gave him Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, to be his wife. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. 13 years had passed since his brothers had thrown him into that pit in Dothan. 13 years of slavery, false accusation, imprisonment, and being forgotten. But now those years of preparation were revealed as exactly that. Preparation for a responsibility that would affect not just Egypt, but the entire known world. As Joseph began his new role, organising the massive project of storing grain for the coming famine, he could not help but remember the dreams of his youth. The sheaves bowing down, the sun and moon and stars paying homage. Those dreams had seemed so impossible during the dark years of his trials. But now he was beginning to see how God had been weaving a story of redemption that was far grander than anything he could have imagined as a 17-year-old boy in his father's house. The 7 years of abundance began exactly as Joseph had predicted, and Egypt's harvests were more bountiful than anyone could remember. Under Joseph's careful supervision, vast storehouses were built in every city, and grain was collected and preserved on an unprecedented scale. The administrative system he designed was so efficient and comprehensive that it became a model for future generations. During this time, Joseph and his wife Asenath were blessed with 2 sons. He named the first Manasseh, saying, "It is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household." The second son he named Ephraim, saying, "It is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering." These names revealed Joseph's heart. He was grateful for the blessing of forgetting the pain of his past, but he also recognized that God had made him fruitful precisely in the place where he had suffered most. His trials had not been meaningless. They had been the very soil in which his greatest purpose had grown. As the 7 years of abundance came to an end and the 7 years of famine began, Joseph's careful preparations proved their worth. While neighbouring countries struggled with crop failures and starvation, Egypt had grain in abundance. People came from all over the known world to buy food from Joseph, and Egypt became the lifeline for countless nations. The famine was severe throughout the world, and it reached even into the land of Canaan where Jacob lived with his family. When Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you just keep looking at each other? I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us so that we may live and not die." So 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt. But Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's younger brother, with the others because he feared that harm might come to him. Benjamin was now the only remaining son of his beloved Rachel, and Jacob could not bear the thought of losing him too. When Joseph's brothers arrived in Egypt and came before him to buy grain, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. Joseph recognized them immediately, but they did not recognize him. Here was the fulfillment of his boyhood dreams, his brothers bowing before him, but it came not with triumph, but with the weight of enormous responsibility. Joseph remembered his dreams about them, but he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. "Where do you come from?" he demanded. "From the land of Canaan," they replied, "to buy food." Joseph accused them of being spies, testing them to see what kind of men they had become. Through a series of encounters, he kept Simeon as a prisoner and demanded that they bring Benjamin to prove their honesty. When they returned with Benjamin, Joseph's emotions nearly overwhelmed him, but he continued to test them. The final test came when Joseph had his silver cup planted in Benjamin's sack, then accused him of theft. When the cup was found, Joseph declared that Benjamin would become his slave. It was then that Judah, the same brother who had suggested selling Joseph years before, stepped forward and offered to take Benjamin's place as a slave, saying he could not bear to see his father's grief if Benjamin did not return. This act of selfless love broke Joseph's heart. His brothers had changed. The jealous, cruel men who had thrown him into a pit were now willing to sacrifice themselves for each other and for their father's happiness. Joseph could no longer control himself. He sent all his attendants away and revealed himself to his brothers. "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" he said, weeping so loudly that the Egyptians heard him. His brothers were terrified, but Joseph reassured them, "Come close to me. I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now, do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no ploughing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God. This was the heart of Joseph's story, not revenge, but redemption, not bitterness, but blessing. He had learned to see God's hand even in the betrayal and suffering he had endured. You intended to harm me, he would later tell them, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Joseph brought his entire family to Egypt, where they were given the best land in Goshen. Jacob, who had mourned Joseph as dead for over 20 years, was reunited with his beloved son. The family was restored, the famine was survived, and the promises God had made to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob continued to unfold through their descendants. When Jacob died years later, Joseph's brothers feared that he might finally take revenge on them. But Joseph wept and said, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." Joseph lived to be 110 years old, seeing his family multiply and prosper in Egypt. Before he died, he made his brothers promise that when God eventually led them back to the Promised Land, they would carry his bones with them. Even in death, Joseph's faith looked forward to the fulfillment of God's promises. Joseph's story teaches us that God can use even the worst circumstances to accomplish his greatest purposes. The pit prepared Joseph for the palace, but more importantly, it prepared his heart for forgiveness. His sufferings were not meaningless. They were the very experiences that shaped him into a man capable of saving nations and reconciling families. In our own lives, we may face betrayal, false accusations, forgotten promises, and years of waiting that seem endless. But Joseph's story reminds us that God is always working, even when we cannot see his hand. Our calling is not to understand his timeline, but to trust his character and remain faithful in whatever circumstances we find ourselves. The dreams God gives us may take decades to fulfill, and they may come to pass in ways we never expected. But his promises are sure, his purposes are good, and his love never fails. From the pit to the palace, from slavery to salvation, from betrayal to blessing. This is the pattern of redemption that runs through Joseph's story, and through our own lives when we place our trust in the God who makes all things work together for good. Rest well tonight, dear friends of Sacred Slumber, knowing that your story too is being written by a loving God who specializes in turning mourning into dancing, ashes into beauty, and the deepest valleys into the highest mountains of purpose and joy. Sweet dreams, and may you find peace in knowing that no matter what pit you may find yourself in today, God is already preparing your palace for tomorrow.
Hello, dear friends, and welcome to Sacred Slumber. Before we begin our journey together into this timeless story of faith and courage, I want to take a moment to connect with you, wherever you are in the world tonight. How has your day been? Perhaps you're settling in as the evening draws near, or maybe you're starting your morning with this gentle retelling. Whether it's midnight where you are, or the sun is just beginning to rise, know that you're exactly where you need to be. I'm curious about where this story is finding you tonight. Are you listening from a cozy bedroom in North America? Perhaps watching the stars appear through your window? Or maybe you're in Europe, beginning a peaceful morning with this tale. Perhaps you're in Asia, Africa, Australia, or anywhere else across our beautiful world. Wherever you are, you're part of our global Sacred Slumber family, and we're so grateful to have you here. If this is your first time joining us, or if you've been with us before, we invite you to subscribe to Sacred Slumber, where we bring you gentle Bible stories and peaceful reflections designed to encourage your heart and strengthen your faith. Now let's settle in together as we journey to ancient Israel, to a valley where faith would triumph over fear, and where a young shepherd boy would show the world that with God all things are possible. The golden sun rises slowly over the valley of Elah, casting long shadows across the rocky terrain. The air is crisp with morning dew, and a gentle breeze carries the scent of wild flowers that dot the hillsides. This valley, nestled between rolling hills covered with olive trees and scattered stones, would soon become the stage for one of history's most remarkable displays of faith. On the eastern ridge, the armies of Israel have made their camp. Hundreds of tents stretch across the hillside, their fabric fluttering softly in the morning breeze. Smoke rises from cooking fires where soldiers prepare their simple breakfast of bread and olives. The men move quietly, their faces etched with concern, their eyes constantly drawn to the valley below and the opposite hill. For across the valley, on the western ridge, stands another camp. The Philistines have pitched their tents there, their bronze weapons glinting in the early light. These are seasoned warriors, confident in their strength, their numbers, and their champion who has struck terror into the hearts of Israel's army for 40 long days. Between these two armies lies the valley itself, a stretch of land that seems to hold its breath in anticipation. The grass grows green here, watered by a small brook that winds its way through the centre of the valley, its waters singing softly over smooth stones. It's a peaceful place, this valley, seemingly too beautiful for the conflict that's about to unfold. But it's here, in this quiet valley, that we find a young man who will change everything. His name is David, and he's not a soldier at all. He's a shepherd from the small town of Bethlehem, the youngest of 8 brothers. While his older brothers serve in King Saul's army, David tends his father's sheep on the hillsides near his home. David has olive skin bronzed by countless hours under the Palestinian sun, and eyes that sparkle with life, an unwavering trust in the God of Israel. His hands, though young, are strong from years of guiding sheep, playing his harp and practicing with his simple shepherd's sling. He's small in stature compared to the warriors in both camps, but there's something different about David, something that sets him apart. It's not his size or his strength, but the quiet confidence that comes from knowing that the God who created the heavens and earth is also the God who watches over him as he watches over his sheep. As the sun climbs higher, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber, a stirring begins in both camps. The day's challenge is about to begin, and David, though he doesn't know it yet, is about to step into a moment that will echo through eternity. For 39 days, the same terrifying scene has played out in the valley of Elah. As the morning sun reaches its full strength, a massive figure emerges from the Philistine camp and strides down the hillside toward the valley floor. This is Goliath of Gath, and he is a sight that would make even the bravest heart tremble. Standing nearly 10 feet tall, Goliath is a giant among men. His frame is muscular and imposing, built like a fortress of flesh and bone. His bronze helmet catches the sunlight, and his scale armour gleams like the surface of a deep, dark sea. Each scale of his armour has been carefully crafted, overlapping like fish scales, to create an almost impenetrable defence. The armour alone weighs more than many men could carry, yet Goliath wears it as easily as another man might wear a simple tunic. In his massive hand he carries a spear whose iron point is as large as a weaver's rod, and whose shaft is thick as a small tree. On his back hangs a bronze sword, and his legs are protected by bronze greaves that shine like mirrors. Walking before him is his armour-bearer, a man who would be considered large in any other company, but appears almost childlike next to his champion. As Goliath reaches the centre of the valley, near the gently flowing brook, he stops and turns to face the Israelite camp on the eastern hill. Then, in a voice that booms across the valley like thunder, he issues his daily challenge. "Why do you come out and line up for battle?" His voice echoes off the hillsides, causing birds to take flight from the olive trees. "Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." He pauses, letting his words sink in, and then continues with a sneer that the Israelite soldiers can hear even from their distant positions. "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." The challenge hangs in the morning air like a dark cloud. On the hillside, King Saul's army shifts nervously. These are not cowards, these soldiers of Israel. They are men who have fought battles and defended their homeland with courage. But Goliath represents something beyond normal warfare. He is not just a man. He seems like a force of nature, an unstoppable mountain of bronze and flesh. Among the Israelite ranks are 3 brothers, Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah, sons of Jesse from Bethlehem. They stand with their fellow soldiers, feeling the same chill of fear that grips every man present. They've heard stories of giants in the land, descendants of the Anakim, who struck terror in the hearts of their forefathers. But seeing Goliath is different from hearing stories. His very presence seems to drain the courage from their hearts. King Saul himself, who stands head and shoulders above most men, feels small in comparison to this Philistine champion. The king who once stood fearlessly against Israel's enemies now finds himself at a loss. He has offered great rewards to any man who will face Goliath, riches beyond measure, his own daughter in marriage, and exemption from taxes for the victor's family. But for 39 days, no man has stepped forward. As Goliath's voice fades across the valley, an oppressive silence settles over both camps. The Philistines are confident, almost jovial in their certainty. Their champion is invincible, and they know it. Soon all of Israel will bow before their might. But in the Israelite camp, fear has taken root like a poisonous vine. With each passing day, with each repeated challenge, that fear grows stronger. The soldiers begin to whisper among themselves. Some wonder if they should retreat. Others question whether God has abandoned them. The shadow of one man, one giant, is darkening the faith of an entire nation. Yet God, who sees all things, who knows the end from the beginning, has already prepared an answer to this seemingly impossible challenge. And that answer is not a mighty warrior or a skilled general. It's a young shepherd boy who at this very moment is walking the dusty roads that lead to the valley of Elah, carrying nothing more threatening than food for his brothers and cheese for their commander. As the day progresses and Goliath returns to his camp with another unchallenged victory, the stage is being set for an encounter that will demonstrate once and for all that the battle belongs not to the strong, but to the Lord. The morning sun is climbing higher when David crests the hill overlooking the valley of Elah. He's been walking since before dawn, carrying a heavy pack filled with roasted grain and 10 loaves of fresh bread for his brothers and 10 cuts of cheese for their unit commander. His father Jesse, concerned about his sons serving in King Saul's army, has sent David to check on them and bring them provisions. As David approaches the Israelite camp, he can hear the familiar sounds of an army preparing for battle. The clank of bronze armour, the scraping of swords being sharpened, and the low murmur of soldiers' voices. But there's something else in the air, something David can sense even before he understands it. There's a tension here, a fear that seems to hang over the camp like morning fog. David makes his way through the camp, asking for directions to find his brothers. The soldiers he passes look weary, their faces drawn with anxiety. Some pace nervously, others sit quietly, staring toward the valley. This is not what David expected to find. Where is the courage of Israel's army? Where is the confidence that should come from serving the God who delivered them from Egypt and gave them this promised land? Finally, David spots his brothers among their unit, and his face brightens with joy. He hurries toward them, his pack bouncing on his shoulders, but as he greets Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah, he notices that they too carry the same haunted expression as the other soldiers. "Father sent provisions," David says warmly, beginning to unpack the food. "He's been worried about you and wanted to make sure you have enough to eat." But before his brothers can respond fully to his greeting, a sound begins to build from across the valley. It starts as a low rumble and grows into the unmistakable boom of Goliath's voice. David stops unpacking and turns toward the valley, his eyes widening as he sees the massive figure striding down the hillside. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? David asks, his voice filled not with fear, but with indignation. The words come naturally to him, spoken with the simple faith of someone who knows God personally, intimately, like a shepherd knows his flock. The soldiers around David stare at him in amazement. Some even step back, as if his words might bring Goliath's wrath down upon them. But David isn't speaking recklessly. He's speaking from a heart that has experienced God's faithfulness. In the quiet places, in the fields where he tends sheep, under the stars where he plays his harp and sings psalms to the God who made them. What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? David continues, his voice carrying a confidence that seems foreign in this camp of frightened warriors. The soldiers explain about King Saul's promised rewards, but David barely seems to hear them. His focus is not on gold or marriage or tax exemption. His concern is for the honour of God and the reputation of God's people. How can this Philistine be allowed to mock the armies of the living God? How can Israel's soldiers allow this blasphemy to continue day after day? Word of David's questions and his bold words quickly spreads through the camp. Some soldiers are amazed by his courage. Others think he's simply too young to understand the danger. But when the news reaches Eliab, David's oldest brother, he responds with anger and embarrassment. "Why have you come down here?" Eliab demands, his face flushed with frustration. "And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle." Eliab's harsh words reveal the tension that can exist even in families when faith and fear collide. Perhaps Eliab is embarrassed that his youngest brother shows more courage than he and his fellow soldiers have demonstrated. Perhaps he's genuinely concerned for David's safety. But David responds with gentle humility. "Now what have I done?" David asks calmly. "Can't I even speak?" He doesn't argue with his brother or defend himself harshly. Instead, he simply continues asking his questions, seeking to understand why no one has stepped forward to defend God's honour. Eventually, word of David's bold questions reaches King Saul himself. The king, desperate for any glimmer of hope, sends for this young man who speaks so fearlessly about facing the Philistine giant. When David is brought before him, Saul sees nothing impressive about this youth. David is small, young, with the sun-darkened skin of someone who works outdoors. He carries no sword, no armour, nothing that would mark him as a warrior. "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine," David says to the king with quiet confidence. "Your servant will go and fight him." King Saul looks at David in disbelief. "You are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him," he says, his voice heavy. with the weight of responsibility and fear. You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth. But David's response comes from a wellspring of faith that has been tested and proven in the wilderness places, where no one was watching. Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep, David begins, his voice steady and sure. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. David pauses, and in that pause the tent seems to fill with the presence of something greater than human courage. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. Here is the key to David's confidence. It's not based on his own strength or skill. It's not rooted in pride or youthful foolishness. David's courage comes from his personal experience of God's faithfulness. In the quiet places when no one was watching except God, David learned to trust. When wild beasts threatened his father's sheep, David didn't run. He stood and fought, not in his own strength, but trusting in the God who had called him to be a shepherd. King Saul, moved by David's faith, and perhaps remembering his own younger days when he trusted God more completely, finally gives his consent. Go, he says, and the Lord be with you. Wanting to give David every possible advantage, Saul dresses him in his own tunic and puts a bronze helmet on his head and a coat of armour on his body. He gives David his own sword to carry, but when David tries to walk in all this military gear, he finds he can hardly move. I cannot go in these, David says to Saul, because I am not used to them. So he takes off the armour, removes the helmet, and sets aside the sword. He will not try to become something he's not, or fight in a way that's foreign to him. David will face Goliath as himself, a shepherd boy who trusts in the living God. Instead, David picks up his staff, the simple wooden rod that has been his companion through countless days in the fields. He goes to the brook that runs through the valley and carefully selects 5 smooth stones worn perfectly round by the flowing water. He places these in his shepherd's bag and takes his sling in his hand. As David walks toward the valley, he carries with him something more powerful than any bronze armour or iron sword. He carries the confidence that comes from knowing God personally, from experiencing his faithfulness in the quiet places of life. And he carries the understanding that this battle is not really between David and Goliath at all. This is a battle between the God of Israel and the false gods of the Philistines, between truth and blasphemy, between faith and fear. The young shepherd is ready to face the giant, not because he is strong, but because he knows the one who is stronger than any earthly power. The afternoon sun hangs bright and warm over the valley of Elah as 2 figures begin their approach toward each other across the grassy floor of the valley. The contrast between them could not be more dramatic, and yet it's precisely in this contrast that God's glory will be revealed. From the western hill, Goliath begins his descent, his bronze armour catching and reflecting the sunlight like a beacon. Each step he takes shakes the ground slightly, and the sound of his armour clanking echoes across the valley. He moves with the confidence of someone who has never known defeat, never felt the sting of uncertainty. His armour-bearer walks before him, carrying the massive shield that will protect the giant from any arrows that might be fired from the Israelite lines. From the eastern hill, David begins his own journey down into the valley. He walks with a steady, purposeful gait, his simple shepherd's clothing a stark contrast to the military spectacle approaching from the other side. In one hand he carries his staff, worn smooth by years of use. In the other, he holds his sling, a simple leather pouch attached to 2 cords. the kind of weapon that shepherds have used for generations to protect their flocks from predators. Behind David on the hillside, the entire Israelite army watches in stunned silence. Thousands of seasoned warriors stand motionless, their eyes fixed on the small figure walking steadily towards certain death. Some of them pray silently, asking God to protect this brave boy. Others shake their heads in disbelief at what they perceive as pointless sacrifice. King Saul watches from his position among his officers, his heart heavy with the responsibility for sending a youth to face a giant. On the opposite hill, the Philistine army watches with amusement and anticipation. They point at David and laugh among themselves, joking about how quickly their champion will dispatch this boy. Some of them are already making plans for the victory celebration they'll hold after Israel surrenders, as surely they must, after witnessing their champion's inevitable defeat. But as David walks down the hillside, his heart is neither fearful nor boastful. Instead, it's filled with a quiet confidence that comes from knowing he is not walking into this valley alone. The same God who helped him rescue sheep from the mouths of lions and bears is with him now. The same God who has been his shepherd will be his strength. As the two figures draw closer together in the centre of the valley, near the gently flowing brook, Goliath gets his first clear look at his opponent. What he sees fills him with contempt and rage. This is not a warrior, this is just a boy, ruddy and handsome, carrying a shepherd's simple tools instead of weapons of war. "Am I a dog," Goliath roars, his voice booming across the valley, "that you come at me with sticks?" His anger at what he perceives as an insult burns hot. He expected Israel to send their greatest warrior, someone worthy of his attention. Instead, they've sent a child. Goliath continues his verbal assault, his voice carrying clearly to both armies. "Come here, and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." The threat hangs in the air like the cry of a predator, and even some of the Philistine soldiers feel a chill at the cruelty in their champion's voice. But David, standing in the valley, with the afternoon sun behind him, casting his shadow long across the grass, remains unshaken. When he speaks, his voice carries clearly across the valley, and every word is heard by both armies. "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin," David calls out, his young voice strong and clear. "But I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." The words echo across the valley like a bell ringing, clear and pure and full of power. David continues, and as he speaks, something changes in the atmosphere of the valley. The mocking laughter from the Philistine hill begins to fade. On the Israelite side, soldiers lean forward, straining to hear every word. "This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." David's words ring with prophetic power and absolute certainty. He's not boasting in his own strength or skill. Instead, he's making a declaration of faith, a public testimony to the power and faithfulness of the God of Israel. This battle, David understands, is not ultimately about military might or human courage. It's about the honour of God and the revelation of his power to both Israel and the surrounding nations. Goliath, enraged by what he sees as blasphemous arrogance from a mere boy, begins moving quickly toward David, his massive frame covering the ground with surprising speed. His armour clanks and his weapons gleam as he bears down on his small opponent like an avalanche of bronze and iron. But David doesn't flee. Instead, he runs toward Goliath, closing the distance between them with swift, determined steps. As he runs, he reaches into his shepherd's bag and takes out one of the smooth stones he selected from the brook. With practiced ease, born of countless hours protecting sheep, he places the stone in his sling. The sling is not a child's toy, though it may appear simple. In the hands of a skilled shepherd, it's a precision weapon capable of tremendous force. David has used his sling to drive off wolves and bears, to guide wandering sheep, and to strike targets with accuracy at considerable distances. Now as he runs toward Goliath, all those years of practice culminate in this single, crucial moment. With fluid motion, perfected through countless repetitions, David begins to swing the sling around his head, building momentum. The leather pouch whispers through the air as it spins, faster and faster. Goliath, seeing David's movement, may have raised his shield or adjusted his position, but his great size, which has always been his advantage, now works against him. He cannot change direction quickly, cannot dodge with the agility of a smaller man. At the perfect moment, when the geometry of angle and distance and momentum align exactly right, David releases one of the cords. The stone flies from the sling like an arrow, swift and straight and true, guided by skill and powered by faith. The stone strikes Goliath in the centre of his forehead, at the one spot where his bronze helmet doesn't protect him, with tremendous force. The sound of impact echoes across the valley like the crack of thunder. For a moment time seems suspended. The giant warrior, seemingly invincible in his bronze armour, stands motionless. Then, like a great tree falling in the forest, Goliath topples forward and crashes to the ground. The earth trembles under the impact of his massive frame. His weapons clatter beside him, his armour scrapes against the stones, and then there is silence. David runs to where Goliath lies and stands over the fallen giant. Finding no sword of his own, David draws Goliath's own massive sword from its sheath, and with effort befitting his size, uses it to cut off the giant's head, fulfilling his prophecy exactly as he had spoken it. Then David lifts Goliath's head high above his own, and his voice rings out across the valley one more time, "The battle is the Lord's." The silence that follows is profound and complete, broken only by the gentle sound of the brook flowing peacefully through the valley, washing the smooth stones that remain in David's shepherd's bag. The sight of their fallen champion creates an immediate and dramatic transformation in both armies. On the Philistine hillside, the confident laughter and casual conversation die away instantly, replaced by stunned silence and then growing panic. These seasoned warriors, who moments before were planning their victory celebration, now stare in disbelief at the impossible scene in the valley below. Their champion, their giant, their seemingly invincible Goliath lies motionless in the grass, his own sword in the hands of the shepherd boy, who stands triumphant beside his massive form. The psychological impact is devastating. If Goliath could fall to this young Israelite, what protection did they have? What power could stand against the God of Israel? On the eastern hillside, the transformation is equally dramatic, but runs in the opposite direction. The Israelite soldiers, who have been paralysed by fear for 40 days, suddenly find their voices in a great roar of triumph that echoes off the surrounding hills. The sound builds and builds, a crescendo of relief and joy and renewed confidence that seems to shake the very foundations of the valley. "The Lord has given us victories," they cry. "God has delivered the Philistines into our hands." Swords are drawn from sheaths, not in fear this time, but in confidence. Spears are raised high, and the entire army begins to surge down the hillside like a mighty river breaking through a dam. King Saul, watching from his position among his officers, feels his own heart lift with amazement and gratitude. The burden of fear that has pressed down on him for weeks suddenly lifts, replaced by the returning memory of what it means to serve the living God. He gives the command that his army is already anticipating. Charge! The Philistine army, seeing the Israelites rushing toward them and having lost their champion and their confidence in a single moment, turns and flees. What had been an organised military force becomes a scattered mob running for their lives across the hills and valleys of the countryside. The rout is complete and devastating. But as the armies chase and flee across the landscape, David remains in the valley beside the brook, holding Goliath's head and looking up toward heaven with a heart full of gratitude. He has not forgotten, even in this moment of triumph, that the victory belongs to the Lord. This was never about David's skill with a sling. Though his years of practice were important, this was never about David's courage. Though his faith was essential, this was about God's power to save his people and his determination to show both Israel and the nations around them that he alone is God. David understands something that many of the celebrating soldiers rushing past him have not yet grasped. This victory in the valley of Elah is not an end in itself, but a beginning. It's a demonstration of what becomes possible when someone is willing to trust completely in God's power and step forward in faith, even when the circumstances seem impossible. As David picks up his simple staff and adjusts his shepherd's bag, still containing 4 unused stones, he reflects on the events of the day. This morning he was simply bringing food to his brothers. Now he has become the deliverer of Israel, the slayer of giants, the one through whom God chose to demonstrate his power to the nations. But David's heart remains humble. He knows that he was simply the instrument God chose to use. The smooth stones came from God's creation. The skill to use the sling came from God's provision of years in the wilderness. The courage to step forward came from God's faithfulness in past trials. Even the opportunity to be in the valley today came from God's sovereign orchestration of events. As the sun begins to set over the valley of Elah, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, David begins the journey back up the hillside. Behind him, the brook continues to flow peacefully, its waters singing the same gentle song they sang this morning, as if nothing extraordinary had happened here at all. But everything has changed. Israel has been delivered from their enemies. The name of the Lord has been glorified before the nations. Fear has been replaced with faith, and despair has given way to hope. Most importantly, everyone who witnessed this day now knows with certainty that there is a God in Israel, and that the battle belongs to the Lord. The young shepherd boy who walked down into the valley, carrying only his simple faith and his trust in God, walks back up the hillside as a champion. But he carries with him the same faith and the same trust, because he understands that these were the real weapons that won the victory. Size and strength and bronze armour are nothing compared to the power of the living God when it flows through a heart that trusts him completely. As David rejoins the celebrating Israelite army, his brothers look at him with new eyes. Eliab, who scolded him harshly this morning, now embraces him with tears of joy and amazement. The soldiers who barely noticed the young shepherd this morning now gather around him with respect and wonder, eager to hear him tell the story of his victory. But David's first words are not about his own actions or his own courage. Instead, he lifts his eyes toward heaven and says simply, "Blessed be the Lord God of Israel, who has delivered his people this day." The victory belongs to the Lord, and David never forgets it. This understanding, this heart of worship and gratitude, even in the moment of triumph, is what will carry David through all the challenges that lie ahead in his remarkable life. For this is not the end of David's story, but the beginning. This day in the valley of Elah reveals the heart of a shepherd who will one day be king, a man after God's own heart who will lead Israel with the same faith and trust he showed when facing a giant with nothing but a sling and the name of the Lord. As we reflect on this timeless story of David and Goliath, we discover that it offers us profound truths that speak directly to our own lives and challenges. The Valley of Elah becomes a classroom where God teaches us about faith, courage, preparation, and the source of true victory. Let's explore these lessons together, allowing them to settle into our hearts like seeds planted in good soil. One of the most striking aspects of David's story is how thoroughly unlikely he seems as a champion. When the prophet Samuel came to Jesse's house to anoint the next king of Israel, Jesse didn't even bother to call David in from the fields at first. David was the youngest, the smallest, the one everyone overlooked. Even his own brothers saw him as insignificant, more of an annoyance than a hero. Yet God specifically chose this overlooked shepherd boy to accomplish what none of Israel's mighty warriors dared attempt. This pattern runs throughout Scripture and continues in our world today. God delights in using people the world considers insignificant to accomplish his greatest purposes. He chooses the weak to shame the strong, the foolish to confound the wise, the humble to teach the proud. This truth offers tremendous encouragement to anyone who has ever felt overlooked, undervalued, or insignificant. Perhaps you feel too young, too old, too inexperienced, or too ordinary to make a difference. Perhaps others have dismissed your dreams or minimized your contributions. If so, you're in excellent company. Moses felt too inadequate to speak for God. Gideon felt too weak to lead an army. Esther felt too powerless to influence a king. Mary felt too young to bear the Messiah. But God sees what others miss. He looks at the heart while others focus on outward appearances. He values faithfulness over fame, character over credentials, availability over ability. When you feel small in the eyes of the world, remember that you serve a God who specializes in doing extraordinary things through ordinary people who trust him completely. The key is not to become someone else, but to offer who you already are to God with complete surrender. David didn't try to become a traditional warrior. He remained a shepherd who trusted God. Your background, your personality, your unique experiences and perspective are not accidents. They are part of God's preparation for the work he has planned for you. David's courage in facing Goliath didn't appear suddenly on the day of battle. It was forged over years of faithful service in places where no one was watching except God. While tending his father's sheep in the wilderness, David faced lions and bears that threatened the flock. In those lonely, dangerous moments, with no audience to impress and no recognition to gain, David learned to depend completely on God's strength. These wilderness experiences became David's training ground. Each time he trusted God to help him protect the sheep, his faith grew stronger. Each time he saw God's faithfulness in the small things, his confidence in God's power increased. By the time he faced Goliath, David had a history with God, a track record of divine assistance that gave him unshakable confidence. This principle applies directly to our lives. The character we develop in private, the faithfulness we demonstrate when no one is watching, the trust we build through small challenges prepare us for the larger battles we'll face later. God often prepares us through what seem like insignificant experiences, developing in us the spiritual muscles we'll need for greater tasks. Perhaps you're in a season of quiet preparation right now. Maybe you're in a job that feels unimportant, dealing with challenges that seem mundane, or serving in ways that go unnoticed. Don't despise these experiences. See them as God's training ground, places where you can learn to trust him completely without the pressure. of public attention. Every act of faithfulness in small things builds spiritual strength. Every time you choose to trust God rather than worry, you're developing the faith muscles you'll need for larger challenges. Every moment you spend in prayer, study and worship during the ordinary days creates the spiritual foundation that will hold firm when storms come. David's Psalms reflect a man who knew God intimately through countless hours of communion in the wilderness. His worship wasn't reserved for public occasions. It was the natural overflow of a heart that had learned to recognise God's presence in solitary places. This private relationship with God became the source of his public courage. The contrast between David's response to Goliath and that of Israel's army reveals the transformative power of proper perspective. The Israelite soldiers saw Goliath's size and focused on their own inadequacy. They measured themselves against the giant and found themselves wanting. Fear paralysed them because they were looking at the problem instead of at God. David saw the same giant but responded completely differently. Instead of focusing on Goliath's size, David focused on God's greatness. Instead of measuring himself against the Philistine champion, he remembered God's faithfulness in past challenges. Most importantly, David saw this confrontation not as David versus Goliath, but as the God of Israel versus the false gods of the Philistines. This shift in perspective made all the difference. When we focus on our problems, they appear insurmountable. When we focus on God, our problems find their proper proportion. The same challenge that paralyses us with fear can become an opportunity to witness God's power when we view it through the lens of faith. Your Goliath may not be a 9-foot giant in bronze armour, but it's probably just as real and just as intimidating. It might be a health diagnosis that fills you with dread, a financial crisis that keeps you awake at night, a broken relationship that seems beyond repair, or a dream that feels impossible to achieve. Whatever giant you're facing, the same God who empowered David is available to you today. The key is learning to see your challenges through God's eyes rather than your own. When you focus on how big your problems are, they grow larger in your mind, and your faith shrinks. But when you focus on how big your God is, your problems find their proper place, and your faith grows stronger. Faith doesn't mean pretending problems don't exist or minimizing real challenges. David didn't pretend Goliath was small. He acknowledged the giant's formidable appearance and weapons. But faith means recognizing that God is greater than any challenge we face, and that his power is available to those who trust him completely. Perhaps the most important lesson from David's story is his understanding that victory belongs to God alone. David never claimed credit for defeating Goliath. He never boasted about his skill with a sling or his courage in facing the giant. Instead, he consistently pointed to God as the source of his victory. This humility wasn't false modesty, it was accurate theology. David understood that without God's strength, he would have been just another casualty in the valley. With God's power, he became an instrument of divine deliverance. The difference was not in David himself, but in David's relationship with God and his willingness to trust completely in divine strength. This principle protects us from both despair and pride. When we face challenges that seem impossible, we can take courage from knowing that we don't have to rely on our own strength. The same God who empowered David is available to empower us. When we experience victory and success, we can maintain humility by remembering that every good gift comes from above. Recognizing that victory belongs to the Lord also frees us from the crushing pressure of trying to achieve success through our own efforts alone. We can work diligently, prepare thoroughly, and act courageously, but we do so knowing that ultimate success depends on God's blessing and power. This perspective brings both peace in the struggle and gratitude in the victory. As we conclude our time together in the valley of Elah, I want you to imagine yourself standing where David stood. The sun is setting behind you, casting long shadows across the grass. In front of you lies whatever giant has been challenging your faith, threatening your peace, or blocking your path forward. Your Goliath might be fear itself, that persistent anxiety that whispers lies about your future and your security. It might be doubt that questions God's goodness when life becomes difficult. Perhaps it's a pattern of sin that seems too strong to break, a relationship that appears too damaged to heal, or a dream that feels too big to pursue. Maybe your giant is loneliness that echoes in empty rooms and quiet evenings, or it could be anger that burns hot and destroys relationships. Perhaps it's despair that covers your days like a dark cloud, making it hard to see hope or purpose. Whatever giant you're facing, remember David's words, "I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty." You don't have to face your challenges alone. You don't have to rely solely on your own strength, wisdom, or resources. The same God who empowered a shepherd boy to defeat a giant warrior is present with you today. Like David, you may feel small and inadequate when you look at the size of your challenges. That's normal and even healthy, because it drives you to depend on God rather than yourself. But don't let the size of your problems overshadow the greatness of your God. Don't let the voice of your giant drown out the whisper of divine love that calls you forward in faith. Remember that God has been preparing you for this moment through all the quiet experiences of your life. Every time you've chosen trust over worry, every moment you've experienced God's faithfulness in small things, every prayer you've whispered in the darkness has been building the spiritual strength you need for this challenge. Take up your simple faith like David took up his sling. Select the smooth stones of God's promises that have been worn smooth by the flowing waters of his love. Step forward, not in your own strength, but in the name of the Lord who loves you completely and fights on your behalf. And remember, the battle belongs to the Lord. Your job is not to guarantee the outcome, but to trust the one who holds the outcome in his hands. Your calling is not to be strong enough to win, but to be faithful enough to step forward when God calls. As you face your giants, may you have David's courage to step forward, his faith to trust completely, and his wisdom to give God all the glory for whatever victories he grants. May you discover, as David did, that with God all things are possible, and that no giant is too large for the power of divine love. Let us pray together. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the story of David and Goliath, which reminds us that you delight in using ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things. Help us to see our challenges through your eyes rather than our own fears. Give us David's courage to step forward when you call, his faith to trust in your power rather than our own strength, and his humility to give you glory for every victory. We place our giants before you today, Lord, whatever form they may take in our lives. We acknowledge that we cannot defeat them in our own strength, but we trust in your power to deliver us. Use our weaknesses to display your strength, our fears to showcase your faithfulness, and our victories to bring glory to your name. Help us to be faithful in the quiet places of preparation, knowing that you are building in us the character and faith we'll need for the challenges ahead. May we never forget that the battle belongs to you, and may we always be quick to give you praise for your goodness and mercy in our lives. In the name of Jesus, our Good Shepherd and mighty champion, we pray. Amen. Sleep well, dear friends, knowing that the same God who was with David in the valley is with you wherever your journey leads. May his peace guard your hearts and minds, and may you wake tomorrow with renewed faith to face whatever giants await. Until we meet again in another story, May God's love surround you like a shepherd's care, and may his strength be your portion in every season. Thank you for joining us at Sacred Slumber, where every story reminds us that we are deeply loved and never alone. Hello friends, and welcome to Sacred Slumber. I hope your day has been filled with blessings, no matter what time you're joining us or where you are in this beautiful world. Before we begin tonight's journey into the remarkable story of Gideon, I want to invite you to subscribe to Sacred Slumber so you never miss these powerful biblical narratives that can transform your heart and strengthen your faith. Now let's settle in as we explore one of the most extraordinary accounts of courage, faith and divine intervention in all of Scripture. The sun hung low over the hills of Israel, casting long shadows across a land that had once flowed with milk and honey. But those days seemed like distant memories now. The once prosperous nation had fallen into chaos, its people scattered and hiding like frightened animals. For 7 long years, the Midianites had swept down upon Israel like locusts, devouring everything in their path. Picture, if you will, the terror that gripped every village and farmstead. Families would wake each morning not knowing if this would be the day the raiders would come. Fathers would venture out to check their crops, only to find them trampled and stolen. Children would be hushed to silence at the first sound of hoofbeats on the horizon. The very air seemed thick with fear and desperation. The Midianites, along with their allies, the Amalekites, and other eastern peoples, had turned the conquest of Israel into an annual ritual. Like a plague of locusts, they would arrive at harvest time, their camels beyond counting, stretching across the landscape as far as the eye could see. They would strip the land bare, taking not only the grain and livestock, but also crushing the spirits of God's chosen people. Farmers had abandoned their fields, choosing instead to hide in mountain caves and underground chambers. The marketplaces that once bustled with commerce now stood empty and silent. What should have been a time of celebration and thanksgiving for the harvest had become a season of dread and starvation. Israel's cities, once proud and strong, had crumbled into mere shadows of their former glory. The walls that should have protected the people lay in ruins, and the gates that once welcomed travellers now hung broken on their hinges. It was as if the very blessing of God had departed from the land, leaving behind only sorrow and defeat. In this atmosphere of despair, mothers would gather their children close and whisper the old stories of how God had delivered their ancestors from Egypt, how he had parted the Red Sea and given them victory over mighty enemies. But those stories seemed like fairy tales now, beautiful but impossible dreams from a time when God still cared about his people. The elders of Israel shook their heads in bewilderment. Where was the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob? Where was the mighty deliverer who had once fought for them? Had he forgotten his covenant? Had he abandoned them to their enemies forever? It was into this world of darkness and desperation that our story begins, in the small town of Ophrah, where a young man named Gideon was about to discover that God had not forgotten his people, after all. But Gideon, like so many others, had lost hope. He had watched his family's livelihood disappear year after year, and he had grown tired of empty promises and unanswered prayers. On this particular day, as storm clouds gathered on the horizon, both literally and figuratively, Gideon was engaged in the dangerous work of threshing wheat, but he wasn't doing it in the traditional threshing floor, where the grain could be properly separated from the chaff by the wind. Instead, he was hidden away in a wine press, a place where grapes were normally crushed to make wine. It was cramped, inefficient, and poorly ventilated, but it offered something more valuable than convenience. It offered concealment from enemy eyes. As Gideon worked in his makeshift hiding place, sweat dripping from his brow in the confined space. He embodied the broken spirit of his entire nation. Here was a man reduced to secret, fearful labour just to provide basic sustenance for his family. The very act of threshing wheat, once a joyful community celebration, had become a furtive, isolated struggle for survival. Little did Gideon know that this moment of apparent defeat would become the launching pad for one of the most remarkable displays of God's power in human history. The God who seemed absent was actually watching, waiting, and preparing to use this unlikely hero in ways that would astound both friend and foe alike. The rhythm of Gideon's work was steady but tense. Each strike of his flail against the wheat stalks echoed softly in the confined space of the wine press. His eyes darted frequently toward the opening above, watching for any sign of danger. The precious grain he was salvaging represented not just food for today, but hope for tomorrow, assuming the Midianites didn't discover his hiding place. The silence of the afternoon was broken by an unexpected voice. "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Gideon's heart nearly stopped. He spun around, flail raised defensively, expecting to see a Midianite scout who had somehow discovered his secret location. Instead, he found himself face to face with a figure unlike any he had ever encountered. The stranger sat calmly beneath the great oak tree that overlooked the wine press, his presence somehow both commanding and peaceful. The greeting struck Gideon as almost mockingly ironic. Mighty warrior? Him? The man who was reduced to threshing wheat in secret, constantly looking over his shoulder in fear. And the Lord is with you? If that were true, then why was Israel suffering under such devastating oppression? "Pardon me, my lord," Gideon replied, his voice heavy with skepticism and pain. "But if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, 'Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt?' But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian." The words poured out of Gideon like water from a broken dam. Years of frustration, disappointment, and unanswered questions came tumbling forth. He had grown up hearing the magnificent stories of God's mighty deeds, of pillars of fire and cloud, of armies defeated and nations subdued. But where was that God now? Where were those miracles when his people needed them most? The stranger listened patiently to Gideon's outburst, showing no offence at the young man's boldness or apparent lack of faith. There was something in his eyes that spoke of ancient wisdom and unlimited compassion. When Gideon finished speaking, the visitor's response was both simple and earth-shattering. "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" The audacity of the command took Gideon's breath away. Save Israel? Him? The implications were staggering. This wasn't a request for him to join an army or support a cause. This was a divine commission to personally lead the deliverance of an entire nation from a seemingly impossible situation. "Pardon me, my lord," Gideon stammered, his mind reeling, "but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." Gideon's response revealed the depth of his feelings of inadequacy. In a culture where tribal strength and family position determined social standing and influence, he saw himself as doubly disqualified. His clan held no political power, commanded no great armies, and possessed no significant wealth. Within that already weak clan, he was the youngest, the most inexperienced, the least likely to be chosen for any position of leadership. But the stranger's next words would echo through the ages as one of the most profound promises ever given to a human being. "I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive." The promise was comprehensive and absolute. Not some of the Midianites, not most of them, but all of them. The victory would be complete and decisive, but more importantly, it would not depend on Gideon's strength, wisdom, or experience. It would depend entirely on the presence and power of God himself. Still struggling to believe what he was hearing, Gideon made a request that would reveal both his desire for faith and his need for certainty. If now I have found favour in your eyes, give me a sign that it is really you talking to me. Please do not go away until I come back and bring my offering and set it before you. The stranger agreed to wait, and Gideon hurried to his house to prepare an offering. His heart raced as he worked, his hands trembling slightly as he prepared a young goat and made bread from an ephah of flour. This was not a small offering by the standards of his time, especially for a family struggling under the oppression of constant raids. Yet something within him compelled him to give generously, to honour this mysterious visitor properly. When Gideon returned with the prepared food, the stranger instructed him to place the meat and unleavened bread on a rock and pour out the broth. Gideon obeyed, though he couldn't understand the purpose of these strange instructions. What happened next would leave no doubt about the supernatural nature of his visitor. The stranger touched the meat and bread with the tip of the staff he carried, and immediately fire flared from the rock, consuming the entire offering in an instant. The flames burned with an intensity and heat that no ordinary fire could match, leaving nothing behind but the memory of their brilliance. In that same moment, the stranger vanished from sight, disappearing as suddenly and mysteriously as he had appeared. Terror gripped Gideon's heart as the full realization of what had just occurred crashed over him like a mighty wave. This had been no ordinary man, no mere messenger or prophet. This had been the angel of the Lord, a manifestation of God himself. In that moment of understanding, Gideon was overwhelmed not with joy, but with mortal fear. "Alas, sovereign Lord," he cried out in anguish, "I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face." In the ancient world, it was believed that no human could see God and live. The very encounter that should have filled him with confidence instead filled him with terror. Had his boldness in questioning and testing the Lord sealed his doom? Would he die for having stood in the presence of the Almighty? But even in his moment of greatest fear, God's grace reached out to comfort him. The voice of the Lord came to him again, gentle and reassuring. "Peace, do not be afraid, you are not going to die." With his own hands, Gideon built an altar on that spot and called it, "The Lord is Peace." The place where he had threshed wheat in fear and desperation had become holy ground, the site of a divine encounter that would change not only his life, but the destiny of an entire nation. As night fell over Ophrah, Gideon stood beside his new altar, his mind swirling with the magnitude of what had occurred. The God of his ancestors had not abandoned Israel after all. He had been working, planning, preparing for this very moment, and somehow, incredibly, he had chosen Gideon to be his instrument of deliverance. Yet even as faith began to bloom in his heart, doubt lingered like shadows at the edges of his mind. The task before him seemed impossible, the odds insurmountable. How could he, one man from the weakest clan in Manasseh, possibly hope to defeat the countless multitudes of Midian and their allies? It was a question that would lead him to make one of the most famous requests for divine confirmation in all of Scripture. The days following Gideon's encounter with the angel of the Lord were filled with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. The divine commissioning had been clear and unmistakable, yet the human heart, prone to doubt and fear, struggled to fully embrace what seemed impossible. Gideon found himself caught between the supernatural certainty of his calling and the natural uncertainties of his circumstances. As he went about his daily tasks, Gideon's mind constantly returned to that moment when fire had consumed his offering and the angel had vanished from sight. Had it really happened? In the bright light of day, with the familiar sounds and sights of ordinary life surrounding him, the encounter almost seemed like a dream. Yet the altar he had built stood as a permanent reminder, its stones bearing witness to the reality of what had occurred. Word began to spread quietly through the region about Gideon's calling. Some believed and were filled with hope for the first time in years. Others were sceptical, wondering how this young man could possibly succeed where so many others had failed. Still others were fearful, worried that any attempt at resistance would only bring more severe retaliation from their oppressors. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on Gideon's shoulders. He was being asked not just to risk his own life, but potentially to lead others to their deaths. What if he had misunderstood? What if his faith had somehow led him astray? The consequences of a mistake would be catastrophic, not just for him, but for all who would follow him. It was in this state of mind that Gideon made his famous request for divine confirmation. The fleece test, as it would come to be known, represented not a lack of faith, but rather a deep desire for certainty in the face of overwhelming responsibility. "If you will save Israel by my hand as you have promised," Gideon prayed earnestly, "look, I will place a wool fleece on the threshing floor. If there is dew only on the fleece, and all the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you said." The request was specific and measurable. In the normal course of nature, dew would form on all surfaces exposed to the night air. If God could reverse this natural process, causing moisture to collect only on the fleece, while leaving the surrounding ground completely dry, it would serve as an unmistakable sign of divine intervention. Gideon placed the fleece carefully on the threshing floor as evening approached. All through the night he must have awakened periodically, wondering what he would find in the morning. As dawn broke, he hurried to the spot where he had placed his test. What he discovered filled him with wonder and awe. The fleece was thoroughly saturated with dew, so much so that when he wrung it out, he was able to fill an entire bowl with water. Yet all around it, the ground was completely dry, as if an invisible barrier had prevented any moisture from settling anywhere but on the wool. The sign was clear and unmistakable, yet Gideon's human nature craved even greater certainty. The magnitude of what he was being called to do seemed to justify asking for additional confirmation. With remarkable humility and boldness he approached God with yet another request. "Do not be angry with me," Gideon prayed, acknowledging that his repeated testing might seem to indicate a lack of trust. "Let me make just one more request. Allow me one more test with the fleece, but this time make the fleece dry and let the ground be covered with dew." This second test was even more remarkable than the first. It would be one thing for God to cause dew to collect on a single object, while keeping the surrounding area dry, but it would be quite another to keep one small piece of wool completely dry while saturating everything around it. This second sign would demonstrate not just God's power over nature, but his precise control over the smallest details. Again, Gideon placed the fleece on the threshing floor and waited through the night. When morning came, he found exactly what he had requested. The fleece was bone dry without a trace of moisture, while the ground all around it sparkled with heavy dew. The grass, the stones, the nearby trees, everything was wet with the night's moisture, except for that one small piece of wool. God had patiently granted both requests, demonstrating not anger at Gideon's need for reassurance, but understanding and compassion for human weakness. The fleece tests revealed important truths about the nature of faith and the character of God. Faith is not the absence of questions or doubts. Rather, it is the willingness to act in obedience despite those questions and doubts. Moreover, God's response to Gideon's requests showed his patience with those who seek him earnestly. He did not rebuke Gideon for his need for confirmation, nor did he withdraw his calling because of the young man's hesitation. Instead, he graciously provided the assurance that Gideon needed to step forward in faith. The fleece tests also demonstrated the balance between seeking divine guidance and taking action. There comes a point when further testing can become an excuse for inaction, when the desire for certainty becomes a barrier to obedience. Gideon wisely limited his requests to 2 clear signs, then proceeded to act on what he'd received. As news of these miraculous signs spread throughout the tribes of Israel, hope began to stir in hearts that had been dormant for years. Perhaps God had not forgotten them after all. Perhaps deliverance was indeed coming through this unlikely young man from Ophrah. But before Gideon could lead Israel into battle against their oppressors, he would need to assemble an army. The call went out throughout the territories of Manasseh, Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali. Men who had been hiding in caves and mountain strongholds began to emerge, drawn by the promise of freedom and the reports of God's miraculous confirmations. The response was overwhelming. 32,000 men answered the call, a substantial army by any measure. These were not professional soldiers, but farmers and craftsmen, fathers and sons, united by their hatred of oppression and their desperate hope for liberation. They came carrying whatever weapons they could find, swords that had been hidden from enemy raids, spears hastily fashioned from farming tools, bows that had been used for hunting game in the wilderness. As Gideon looked out over this vast assembly of volunteers, he might have felt a surge of confidence. Surely with 32,000 men, even amateur fighters, he could mount a credible challenge to the Midianite forces. The odds were still daunting, given that the enemy could field armies many times larger, but at least now they had a fighting chance. Yet God had other plans. The fleece tests had been preparation not just for Gideon's faith, but for an even greater demonstration of divine power. The true test was not whether Gideon could trust God with impossible signs, but whether he could trust God with an impossible strategy. What happened next would shock both Gideon and his army, challenging every human assumption about warfare and victory. God was about to demonstrate that his ways are not our ways, and that his power is made perfect, not in human strength, but in human weakness. The morning sun cast long shadows across the camp as 32,000 men prepared for what they believed would be their march to war. Weapons were sharpened, provisions were packed, and final prayers were offered. The air buzzed with nervous energy as farmers turned warriors contemplated the battle that lay ahead. Gideon moved among his troops, offering words of encouragement and trying to project the confidence that a leader must display. Yet privately, he was still awed by the magnitude of what was happening. Just weeks earlier, he had been hiding in a wine press, and now he stood at the head of the largest volunteer army Israel had assembled in generations. But as the army prepared to march toward the enemy encampment, God spoke to Gideon with words that must have sent shockwaves through his entire being. "You have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me. Our own strength has saved us." Too many men? The statement seemed to defy all military logic. The Midianites and their allies numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Their camels alone described as being like locusts for multitude. How could 32,000 possibly be considered too many? Yet God's reasoning revealed a profound truth about the nature of divine deliverance. If Israel won the coming battle through conventional military means, they would inevitably credit their victory to their own strength, strategy, and courage. The victory needed to be so obviously supernatural, that no one could mistake its source. God's glory was at stake, and that glory could not be shared with human pride. Following God's instructions, Gideon stood before his assembled army and made an announcement that must have stunned many of the volunteers. Anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead. The offer was based on an ancient law found in Deuteronomy, which recognised that fearful soldiers could spread panic through the ranks and actually weaken an army's effectiveness. But in this case, the dismissal served a different purpose entirely. God was beginning the process of reducing the army to a size that would make his intervention unmistakable. The response to Gideon's announcement was immediate and devastating. 22,000 men took advantage of the opportunity to withdraw from what many probably saw as a suicide mission anyway. These were not cowards in the traditional sense. They were ordinary people facing an extraordinary situation, and they chose the safety of their families over the uncertainties of battle. As Gideon watched more than 2/3 of his army walk away, his heart must have sunk. 10,000 men remained, still a respectable force, but far fewer than what seemed necessary for the task ahead. Surely now they could proceed with God's blessing. But God was not finished with his reductions. "There are still too many men," came the divine word. "Take them down to the water, and I will thin them out for you there. If I say, 'This one shall go with you,' he shall go. But if I say, 'This one shall not go with you,' he shall not go." The instruction was puzzling and specific. Gideon was to observe how the men drank water and select his final army based on their drinking method. Of all the criteria that might be used to choose warriors, how they consumed water seemed among the least relevant to military prowess. At the water's edge, the 10,000 men revealed their character through their approach to drinking. The vast majority knelt down and put their faces directly to the water, drinking deeply and focusing entirely on satisfying their thirst. But a small group, only 300 men, demonstrated a different approach. They brought water to their mouths with their hands, lapping it like dogs while maintaining their vigilance and readiness. God's instruction was clear. "With the 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands. Let all the others go home." The reduction was complete and shocking. From 32,000 to 300 represented a decrease of more than 99%. What had begun as a substantial army was now reduced to little more than a large company. The odds, already daunting, had become mathematically absurd. Yet the selection criteria revealed profound spiritual truths. The 300 men who were chosen had demonstrated alertness, self-discipline, and readiness, even in a moment of personal need. While drinking, they had maintained their awareness of their surroundings, prepared for action at a moment's notice. These qualities, while admirable in soldiers, were really symbols of spiritual preparedness and faithfulness. As the dismissed soldiers departed, taking most of the weapons and supplies with them, Gideon was left with 300 men who looked more like a ceremonial guard than a fighting force. The enemy they faced was described in terms that emphasized their overwhelming numbers. All the Midianites, the Amalekites, and the other eastern peoples had settled in the valley, thick as locusts. Their camels could no more be counted than the sand on the seashore. The disparity was so extreme that it moved beyond the realm of military strategy into the realm of the miraculous. No human commander would voluntarily reduce his forces to such a level when facing such overwhelming odds. Yet this was precisely God's point. The victory that was coming would be so clearly divine in origin that no one could attribute it to human planning or prowess. For Gideon, this final reduction must have been the ultimate test of faith. Everything in his military thinking, everything in his natural instincts, everything in conventional wisdom screamed against such a strategy. Yet his experiences with the fleece had prepared him for this moment. He had learned to trust God's ways even when they contradicted human logic. The 300 men who remained showed remarkable faith as well. They could see the enemy forces spread across the valley below them. They knew the odds better than anyone, yet they chose to stay, to trust in the God who had called them through his servant Gideon. As night fell over the Israelite camp, the 300 men prepared for what would be the most unconventional battle in military history. They had no idea that they were about to participate in a victory that would be remembered and celebrated for thousands of years. A victory that would demonstrate God's power to use the weak to confound the mighty. The stage was set for a night that would change everything. The Midianites slept in their countless tents, confident in their overwhelming superiority. The 300 Israelites made their final preparations, trusting in a God who specialized in impossible victories. The hours before dawn are often the darkest, both literally and figuratively. As Gideon and his 300 men crouched in the hills overlooking the vast enemy encampment, the weight of their impossible mission pressed down upon them like a physical burden. The valley below was filled with the tents of their enemies, stretching as far as the eye could see in the starlight, a sea of canvas that housed an army larger than any they had ever faced. Despite the miraculous signs he had witnessed and the divine assurances he had received, Gideon still struggled with doubt. God, in his infinite understanding of human nature, provided one more confirmation before the battle commenced. "Get up, go down against the camp," the Lord instructed, "because I am going to give it into your hands. If you are afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah and listen to what they are saying. Afterward, you will be encouraged to attack the camp." The offer revealed God's compassionate understanding of Gideon's anxiety. Rather than rebuking him for his continued fears, the Lord provided an opportunity for reassurance. Taking his servant Purah with him, Gideon crept down toward the perimeter of the enemy camp under cover of darkness. The Midianite camp was massive beyond imagination. Thousands upon thousands of tents housed warriors from multiple nations united in their conquest of Israel. The sounds of the sleeping army filled the night air, snoring soldiers, restless camels, the occasional challenge of sentries. The very scale of the enemy forces should have been overwhelming to any reasonable observer. As Gideon and Purah approached the outer edge of the camp, they overheard a conversation between two Midianite soldiers. One was telling his companion about a disturbing dream he had experienced. "I had a dream. A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp. It struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed." The interpretation offered by his fellow soldier was even more remarkable. "This can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon son of Joash, the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands." The irony was profound. Here in the heart of the enemy camp, God was providing confirmation through the mouths of Israel's oppressors themselves. The barley bread in the dream was significant. Barley was considered the food of the poor, inferior to wheat. Yet in the dream, this humble loaf had the power to destroy the entire enemy position. The symbolism was clear. God would use the humble and despised to bring down the mighty and proud. That Gideon's name was already known to the enemy indicated that word of the gathering Israelite resistance had reached their ears. Rather than being encouraged by their overwhelming numerical superiority, some among the Midianites were apparently experiencing anxiety about this upstart Hebrew leader. God was already working in the hearts and minds of the enemy, preparing them for defeat. Gideon and Purah retreated to their own lines, hearts pounding with excitement and renewed confidence. The doubt that had plagued Gideon was finally dispelled by this remarkable confirmation. When they reached the Israelite position, Gideon called his men together for final instructions. "Get up," he announced with newfound authority and confidence. "The Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands." What followed was perhaps the most unusual battle plan in military history. Instead of swords and spears, Gideon distributed trumpets, empty clay jars, and torches to each of his 300 men. The weapons of conventional warfare were set aside in favour of items that seemed more suited to a religious ceremony than a military campaign. Gideon divided his small force into 3 companies of 100 men each. The strategy was simple, yet audacious. They would surround the enemy camp and, at Gideon's signal, create as much noise and confusion as possible while giving the appearance of a much larger force. "Watch me," Gideon instructed his men. "Follow my lead. When I get to the edge of the camp, do exactly as I do. When I and all who are with me blow our trumpets, then from all around the camp blow yours and shout, 'For the Lord and for Gideon.'" The plan required perfect timing and coordination. Each man would conceal his torch inside a clay jar, maintaining complete darkness and silence until the moment of attack. Then at Gideon's signal, they would simultaneously break their jars, revealing blazing torches, blow their trumpets with all their might, and shout their battle cry. The psychological impact was designed to be devastating. The enemy would suddenly find themselves surrounded by lights and noise, creating the impression of a massive attacking force. In the confusion of a night assault, with limited visibility and the disorientation of being awakened from sleep, even experienced soldiers could panic and lose their sense of direction. As the 3 companies moved into position around the vast perimeter of the enemy camp, each man must have felt the weight of the moment. They were not professional soldiers, but ordinary citizens who had answered the call to fight for their freedom. Now they found themselves in the most critical moment of their lives, armed with the most unconventional weapons imaginable, trusting in a God who had promised victory through seemingly impossible means. The middle watch around midnight was traditionally the time when sentries were changed, and vigilance was often at its lowest point. It was at this precise moment that Gideon and his 100 men reached their assigned position on the edge of the camp. Across the valley, 200 other men waited in similar positions, every eye fixed on their leader for the signal that would begin the battle. Gideon raised his torch-filled jar high above his head, then brought it down sharply, smashing it against a rock. The clay shattered with a sound that seemed to echo across the silent valley, and immediately his torch blazed forth in the darkness. At the same instant, he lifted his trumpet to his lips and blew a long, piercing blast. "For the Lord and for Gideon," he shouted at the top of his lungs. The signal rippled around the camp as 300 jars smashed simultaneously. 300 torches burst into flame, and 300 trumpet heights sounded their defiant call. The battle cry of "For the Lord and for Gideon" echoed from every direction, creating the impression that the Midianite camp was completely surrounded by a massive army. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Thousands of sleeping soldiers were jolted awake to find their camp surrounded by blazing lights and deafening noise. In the confusion and darkness, panic spread like wildfire through the ranks. Soldiers stumbled from their tents, grabbing whatever weapons they could find, unable to determine the size or direction of the attacking force. In their panic and confusion, the Midianites and their allies began attacking each other. Unable to distinguish friend from foe in the darkness, and hearing battle cries in their own languages from every direction, They assumed they had been betrayed by their allies. The coalition that had seemed so formidable began to tear itself apart. The 300 Israelites maintained their positions around the perimeter, continuing to blow their trumpets and hold their torches high, creating the illusion of a massive army that had the enemy completely surrounded. They watched in amazement as God fulfilled his promise in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. The panic spread throughout the entire camp like a plague. What had begun as confusion quickly escalated into a full-scale rout as the enemy forces fled in every direction, abandoning their weapons, supplies, and even their camels in their desperate attempt to escape what they perceived as certain destruction. The victory was complete and overwhelming, achieved not through superior numbers or military might, but through divine intervention, working through the obedience of 300 faithful men. The God who had called Gideon from his hiding place in the winepress had once again demonstrated that his power is made perfect in human weakness. As dawn broke over the valley, an astonishing sight greeted the 300 Israelites. Where the night before had stood the mighty encampment of Israel's oppressors, now lay only scattered debris and abandoned supplies. Tents stood empty, their guy ropes cut by fleeing soldiers. Weapons lay discarded where they had fallen from panicked hands. The camels that had been described as innumerable as locusts wandered aimlessly, their owners having fled into the wilderness. The ground itself told the story of the night's chaos. Bloodstains marked the spots where confused allies had struck down one another in the darkness. Personal belongings were strewn across the landscape as the fleeing army had abandoned everything that might slow their escape. The scene looked less like the aftermath of a battle and more like the remnants of a catastrophic natural disaster. Gideon and his men moved through the abandoned camp in wonder, scarcely believing what their eyes were witnessing. The victory was so complete, so overwhelming, that it seemed almost too good to be true. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The army that had terrorized Israel for 7 years had been routed by 300 men armed with trumpets and torches. But God's deliverance was not yet complete. Even as the 300 marvelled at what had occurred in the valley, word of the miraculous victory was spreading throughout the hill country of Israel. Men who had dismissed Gideon's call to arms, who had remained hidden in their caves and strongholds, now emerged with renewed courage and determination. The tribes of Naphtali, Asher and Manasseh rallied to pursue the fleeing Midianites. What had begun with 300 faithful men now swelled into a national movement of liberation. The psychological impact of the victory was as important as the military result. The myth of Midianite invincibility had been shattered in a single night, and the spirit of resistance that had been dormant for so long now burst forth like a river breaking through a dam. Gideon sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim with urgent instructions. Come down against the Midianites and seize the waters of the Jordan ahead of them as far as Beth-barah. This strategic move would cut off the enemy's escape routes and ensure that the victory would be complete. The Ephraimites responded with enthusiasm, capturing the fords of the Jordan and trapping many of the fleeing Midianites. In the pursuit that followed, they captured 2 of the Midianite leaders, Oreb and Zeb, whose names meant raven and wolf. These princes, who had struck terror into Israelite hearts for years, were now defeated and killed at the places that would forever bear their names: the rock of Oreb and the winepress of Zeb. The pursuit continued beyond the Jordan as Gideon and his original 300, though exhausted, pressed on to capture the remaining Midianite kings, Zaba and Zalmunna. The victory was total and decisive. An empire that had dominated the region for 7 years was completely destroyed in a matter of days. The land of Israel enjoyed peace for 40 years during Gideon's lifetime. The oppression that had driven families into hiding was replaced by prosperity and security. Fields that had been abandoned were cultivated again. Markets that had stood empty bustled with commerce. Children who had grown up knowing only fear could now play freely in their villages. But perhaps the greatest victory was not military but spiritual. Israel had rediscovered that their God was still the same mighty deliverer who had brought their ancestors out of Egypt. The impossible victory served as a permanent reminder that with God all things are possible. The story of Gideon and the 300 speaks across the centuries, with timeless truths that challenge and encourage us today. First, we see that God uses the unlikely. Gideon was not a seasoned warrior or a natural leader. He was a fearful farmer, hiding from his enemies. Yet God saw potential that others missed. This reminds us that God's calling is not based on our qualifications, but on his purposes. Second, the reduction of Gideon's army from 32,000 to 300 demonstrates that faith matters more than numbers. In a world obsessed with statistics and metrics, God's economy operates differently. He delights in using small faithful remnants to accomplish great things, ensuring that his power, not human strength, receives the glory. Third, Gideon's requests for signs teach us about the balance between faith and doubt. God was patient with Gideon's need for confirmation, showing us that honest questions and requests for reassurance are not signs of weak faith but of a heart that desires to walk in God's will. Finally, the story shows us that obedience in the face of fear is the essence of courage. Gideon was afraid, his army was outnumbered, and the strategy seemed foolish. Yet they obeyed, and God honoured their faithfulness with victory. When we feel unqualified for the tasks before us, when the odds seem insurmountable, when we need reassurance before taking steps of faith, the story of Gideon reminds us that our God specialises in impossible victories. He is still calling ordinary people to extraordinary purposes, still using the weak to confound the mighty, still turning fearful hearts into faithful warriors. The God who met Gideon at the winepress is the same God who meets us in our hiding places today, calling us to step out in faith and watch him work miracles through surrendered lives. Just as the 300 trumpets and torches became instruments of divine victory, our simple obedience can become the means through which God accomplishes his purposes in our generation. May we have the courage to answer when he calls, the faith to trust when he leads, and the persistence to follow when he sends us into battles that seem impossible to win. For with God, the 300 can defeat the multitudes, and faith can move mountains that seem immovable. The story of Gideon reminds us that our greatest victories come not when we feel strong and capable, but when we acknowledge our weakness and depend completely on God's strength. In those moments of surrender, we discover that we serve a God who delights in doing the impossible through the most unlikely people. And so the story ends where it began, with an invitation to faith, a call to courage, and a promise that the God who delivered Israel through Gideon and the 300 is still delivering his people today, one impossible victory at a time. The fire on Mount Carmel, Elijah and the prophets of Baal. Hello everyone, and welcome to Sacred Slumber. Before we dive into today's powerful message, I want to connect with each of you personally. How has your day been treating you so far? Whether you're watching this in the early morning hours as the sun rises, during your lunch break, in the middle of a busy day, or perhaps late at night when the world has quieted down, I want you to know that this moment we're sharing together is sacred. I'm curious about where you're joining us from today. Are you listening from bustling New York City, the peaceful countryside of Iowa, the sunny beaches of California, or maybe you're tuning in from across the globe in London, Sydney, or somewhere in between. Wherever you are, whatever time it is in your corner of the world, you are exactly where God wants you to be right now. If this is your first time joining us, I want to extend a warm welcome to our Sacred Rest family. We're so grateful you're here. And if you've been walking this journey with us, thank you for your continued faithfulness and support. Before we begin today's incredible story, I encourage you to subscribe to Sacred Slumber if you haven't already. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss these life-changing messages that God has in store for us. Now let's prepare our hearts for what I believe will be one of the most dramatic, faith-building stories you'll hear. Today we're travelling back over 2,800 years to witness one of the most spectacular demonstrations of God's power ever recorded in human history. We're going to Mount Carmel in ancient Israel, where one man's faith stood against an entire nation's rebellion, where fire fell from heaven, and where hearts were turned back to the one true God. The fire on Mount Carmel, Elijah and the prophets of Baal. Chapter 1. A nation in spiritual freefall. Picture, if you will, the ancient kingdom of Israel during one of its darkest hours. This wasn't just a time of political upheaval or economic hardship, though both of those existed. This was a time of complete spiritual catastrophe, a moment when an entire nation had turned its back on the God who had delivered them from slavery in Egypt, who had parted the Red Sea, who had given them the Promised Land. King Ahab sat on the throne of Israel, and beside him ruled Queen Jezebel, a woman whose very name has become synonymous with wickedness and manipulation. Jezebel wasn't just content to worship false gods herself. She was determined to drag the entire nation of Israel down with her into the depths of idolatry and spiritual darkness. Under their reign, temples to Baal began sprouting up across the landscape like poisonous mushrooms after a storm. Baal was the Canaanite storm god, supposedly the controller of rain and fertility, the giver of crops and abundance. The people were drawn to him because they believed he could provide what they desperately needed: prosperity, security, and success. Sound familiar? In our modern world, we may not bow down to statues of Baal, but how many of us have made idols out of our careers, our bank accounts, our social media followers, or our pursuit of comfort and pleasure? The heart of humanity hasn't changed much in nearly 3,000 years. But Jezebel wasn't satisfied with just building temples. She launched a systematic persecution campaign against the prophets of the Lord. These faithful men and women of God were hunted down like criminals. Some were executed, others were forced to hide in caves and secret places, living in constant fear for their lives. The word of God was being silenced, and darkness was spreading across the land like a plague. Can you imagine living in such a time, when speaking the truth about God could cost you your life, when the very foundations of faith that had sustained a nation for generations were being torn down brick by brick, when it seemed like evil had won and righteousness had fled? Yet in the midst of this spiritual holocaust, God had his man. His name was Elijah, and he was about to become the most famous prophet in Israel's history. Chapter 2. The Drought of Divine Judgment. Before we meet Elijah face to face, we need to understand the backdrop against which his ministry unfolded. For 3 long years, not a single drop of rain had fallen on the land of Israel. This wasn't just an inconvenient dry spell or a minor weather pattern. This was divine judgment, God's response to a nation that had forgotten him and chased after false gods. The drought was devastating in ways that are hard for us to fully comprehend in our modern world of grocery stores and water systems. Rivers that had flowed for centuries dried up to cracked mud. Wells that had sustained families for generations ran completely dry. Crops withered in the fields, livestock died, and famine stalked the land like a relentless predator. People were desperate. Children cried from hunger. Farmers watched helplessly as their fields turned to dust. Merchants had nothing to sell, and families had nothing to eat. The very fabric of society was unravelling under the weight of this supernatural judgment. And yet, in their desperation, most of the people didn't turn back to the Lord. Instead, they cried out even more desperately to Baal, pleading with the storm god to send rain. They increased their sacrifices, intensified their rituals, and multiplied their prayers to deaf idols. They were convinced that if they just tried harder, if they just offered more, if they just believed with greater fervour, Baal would answer and the rains would come. But the skies remained as bronze, hard and unyielding. Day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, the sun blazed down mercilessly from a cloudless sky. The drought continued, and Baal remained silent. This is the world into which God sent his prophet Elijah. Not a comfortable world of revival meetings and supportive congregations, but a hostile environment where speaking God's truth could mean death, where the majority had embraced lies and where the very elements seemed to declare that God's judgment was upon the land. Chapter 3. Enter Elijah, the man of fire. Elijah appears in the biblical narrative like a bolt of lightning splitting the darkness. We don't know much about his background or his early life. He's introduced simply as Elijah the Tishbite, from Tishbe in Gilead. No impressive genealogy, no royal connections, no seminary degrees or credentials. Just a man from a small town that most people had probably never heard of. But what Elijah lacked in pedigree, he more than made up for in faith, courage, and an unshakable conviction that the Lord God of Israel was the one true God. While the nation around him bowed to Baal, Elijah stood firm. While others compromised and conformed, Elijah remained faithful. While the majority chose the easy path of popular religion, Elijah chose the narrow way of truth. God had sustained Elijah supernaturally during the 3 years of drought. First, he had sent him to the brook Cherith, where ravens brought him bread and meat every morning and evening, and he drank from the brook. When the brook dried up, God sent him to a widow in Zarephath, where a handful of flour and a little oil miraculously sustained 3 people for over a year. These experiences had built Elijah's faith to an unshakable level. He had seen God's provision in impossible circumstances. He had witnessed miracles that defied natural law. He had learned to trust completely in God's power and faithfulness, even when everything around him suggested that God had forgotten or abandoned his people. Now, as the drought entered its 3rd year, God was ready to use his seasoned servant for the greatest demonstration of divine power Israel had seen since the days of Moses. The time had come for a showdown that would echo through the ages, a confrontation that would prove once and for all who was the true God and who were merely the inventions of human imagination. Chapter 4. The Divine Commission. The word of the Lord came to Elijah with crystal clarity. Go and present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the land. It was time for the drought to end, but first there would be a reckoning. God wasn't just going to quietly restore the rain and let everyone go back to their lives as if nothing had happened. He was going to make a statement that would be impossible to ignore or explain away. Elijah set out to find King Ahab, but Ahab was already looking for him. The king had been searching throughout his own kingdom and in neighbouring nations, trying to find the prophet he blamed for the drought. When Ahab finally encountered Elijah, his greeting was filled with accusation and anger. Is that you troubler of Israel? Can you imagine the audacity? Here was a king who had led his nation into idolatry, who had allowed his wife to murder God's prophets, who had built temples to false gods throughout the land, and he had the nerve to call God's faithful prophet a troublemaker. It's a perfect example of how sin blinds us to our own responsibility and causes us to blame others for the consequences of our own choices. But Elijah didn't back down. With the boldness that comes from knowing you're standing on the side of truth, he fired back. I have not made trouble for Israel, but you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals. This wasn't just a theological debate or a polite disagreement about religious preferences. This was a confrontation between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of darkness, between truth and deception, between the power of the Almighty and the impotence of human-made idols. Chapter 5. The challenge issued. Elijah then issued a challenge that would go down in history as one of the most dramatic moments in all of Scripture. Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. Mount Carmel was the perfect location for this showdown. Rising about 1,800 feet above sea level, it offered a commanding view of the surrounding countryside and could accommodate the massive crowd that would gather. More importantly, Mount Carmel was considered sacred to Baal worship. The Canaanites believed it was one of Baal's favourite dwelling places. By choosing this location, Elijah was essentially challenging Baal on his home turf. The terms of the contest were elegantly simple. Get 2 bulls for us. Let Baal's prophets choose one for themselves, and let them cut it into pieces and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. The God who answers by fire, he is God. It was brilliant in its simplicity. No complicated rituals, no ambiguous signs that could be interpreted different ways, no room for trickery or deception. Fire from heaven would be the ultimate proof. The God who could send fire to consume the sacrifice would be proven to be the true God. The people's response revealed both their spiritual confusion and their deep hunger for truth. What you say is good. They were tired of the uncertainty, tired of not knowing which God to trust, tired of the drought and the suffering. They wanted a clear answer, and Elijah's challenge offered exactly that. Chapter 6. The prophets of Baal take the stage. As dawn broke over Mount Carmel, an incredible scene began to unfold. Hundreds of prophets of Baal gathered around their altar, dressed in their ceremonial robes, carrying their ritual instruments, confident in their God's ability to answer their call. After all, they outnumbered Elijah 450 to 1. They had the backing of the royal court. They had been the religious establishment for years. Surely their God would not fail them now, especially not on his sacred mountain. They began their ritual early in the morning with great enthusiasm and confidence. "Baal, answer us," they cried, their voices echoing across the mountainside. They danced around their altar with wild abandon, their movements becoming more and more frenzied as they worked themselves into a religious fervour. This wasn't a quiet, dignified ceremony. This was raw, primal religion at its most intense. They leaped and shouted, they waved their arms and beat their chests. They called upon their God with every fibre of their being. The sound of their voices, the pounding of their feet, the clashing of their instruments created a cacophony that could be heard for miles around. But as the morning wore on and became noon, something became increasingly obvious. Nobody was answering. The sky remained clear and cloudless. No fire fell from heaven. No voice spoke from the heavens. The The altar remained cold and lifeless, despite all their passionate pleading. You have to understand, these weren't insincere men going through empty motions. These prophets genuinely believed in Baal. They had devoted their lives to serving him. They had staked their reputations, their careers, and their very identities on the belief that he was real and powerful. The failure of their God to respond wasn't just embarrassing, it was devastating to everything they had built their lives upon. Chapter 7. Elijah's Divine Sarcasm. As the noon sun blazed overhead and the prophets of Baal continued their increasingly desperate rituals, Elijah decided it was time for some divine commentary. With a wit that was both cutting and brilliant, he began to mock their futile efforts. "Shout louder! Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought, or busy, or travelling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened." Can you imagine the scene? Here's Elijah, one man against 450, calmly watching their frantic efforts and offering helpful suggestions for why their God might not be responding. The sarcasm was devastating because it highlighted the absurdity of their situation. If Baal was truly the almighty storm god they claimed he was, why would he need to be awakened? Why would he be too busy or distracted to answer his devoted followers in their hour of greatest need? But Elijah's mockery served a deeper purpose than just humiliating the false prophets. He was exposing the fundamental weakness of all false gods. They are not truly there. They cannot hear because they have no ears. They cannot speak because they have no voice. They cannot act because they have no power. They are creations of human imagination, given form by human hands, but possessing no divine substance. The prophets of Baal, stung by Elijah's taunts and desperate to prove their God's reality, intensified their efforts to an almost unbelievable degree. They began to cut themselves with swords and spears, following their religious traditions until their blood flowed freely. This wasn't just symbolic, this was literal self-mutilation in the name of religious devotion. From noon until evening, they continued this horrific display, their voices growing hoarse from shouting, their bodies weakened by loss of blood, their spirits crushed by the growing realization that their God was not going to answer. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. On one side, frantic activity and desperate self-harm producing nothing. On the other side, one man waiting calmly for his turn, confident in his God's ability to act. Chapter 8. Elijah prepares his altar. As evening approached and the prophets of Baal finally exhausted themselves in defeat, Elijah stepped forward to take his turn. But before he called upon the Lord, he had some important work to do. "Come here to me," he called to all the people. This wasn't going to be a private ceremony or a mystical ritual performed in secret. Everything Elijah was about to do would be in full view of hundreds or perhaps thousands of witnesses. There would be no opportunity for trickery, no possibility of deception, no room for doubt about what actually happened. The first thing Elijah did was repair the altar of the Lord that had been torn down. This altar represented the nation's covenant relationship with God, a relationship that had been broken by years of idolatry and rebellion. By repairing it, Elijah was symbolically calling the nation back to their true identity as God's chosen people. He took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes of Israel, even though the kingdom had been divided for generations. In God's eyes, his people were still one nation, still his chosen ones, still the objects of his covenant love, despite their unfaithfulness. Each stone was a reminder of God's promises to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, promises that remained in effect despite the people's rebellion. With these 12 stones, Elijah built an altar in the name of the Lord. Then he dug a trench around it, large enough to hold about 15 litres of water. This wasn't just for dramatic effect. It was about to serve a very important purpose in demonstrating that what was about to happen could only be attributed to divine intervention. Chapter 9. The Ultimate Act of Faith. What Elijah did next was so audacious, so seemingly foolish, that it takes your breath away. Remember, this was in the 3rd year of a devastating drought. Water was more precious than gold. People were dying of thirst. Every drop was carefully conserved and rationed. And Elijah ordered 4 large jars to be filled with water and poured over the offering and the wood. Can you imagine the gasps from the crowd? Can you picture the shock on people's faces as they watched precious, life-giving water being poured out lavishly over an altar? Some in the crowd probably thought Elijah had lost his mind. Others might have been angry at what seemed like a wasteful display. But Elijah wasn't finished. "Do it again," he said. And they did it a second time, pouring out 4 more jars of precious water over the sacrifice and the wood. "Do it a 3rd time," Elijah commanded. And a 3rd time they soaked the altar until the water ran down around it and filled the trench he had dug. 12 jars of water in total. Everything was completely saturated. The wood was soaked through. The sacrifice was drenched. The stones were wet. Even the ground around the altar was muddy with water. If anyone had been planning to suggest that Elijah had somehow hidden fire or used trickery to ignite his altar, that possibility was now completely eliminated. This act of faith was staggering. Elijah was so confident in God's power that he was willing to make the miracle as difficult as possible. He wasn't just asking God to light dry wood. He was asking him to consume a sacrifice that was literally underwater. He was putting his reputation, his ministry, and his very life on the line, betting everything on God's ability to do the impossible. Chapter 10. The Prayer that Shook Heaven and Earth. As evening approached and the time for the evening sacrifice arrived, Elijah stepped up to the altar he had prepared. The moment had come. Everything led to this point. The drought, the confrontation with Ahab, the challenge to the prophets of Baal, the repair of the altar, the soaking with water, all of it was preparation for this moment when one man would call upon the name of the Lord. But notice what Elijah didn't do. He didn't scream and shout like the prophets of Baal. He didn't dance wildly, or cut himself, or work himself into a frenzy. He didn't perform elaborate rituals, or recite complicated incantations. He simply prayed, and his prayer was a model of faith, simplicity, and complete dependence upon God. "Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel," he began, immediately identifying the God he served not as a local deity or a tribal God, but as the God of the covenant, the God who had made promises to the patriarchs and had been faithful to those promises for generations. "Let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command." This wasn't about Elijah's reputation or glory. This wasn't about proving his own power or wisdom. This was about demonstrating to a watching world that the Lord alone is God, and that Elijah was merely his obedient servant. "Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." The purpose of the miracle wasn't to show off, or to defeat enemies, but to turn hearts back to God. This was an act of divine love, a desperate attempt to rescue a nation from the spiritual destruction they had brought upon themselves. The prayer was short, simple, and powerful. No theatrical performance, no manipulation of emotions, no attempt to work up faith through human effort. Just a straightforward request from a faithful servant to his all-powerful God. Chapter 11. fire falls from heaven. What happened next has never been equalled in human history. The response to Elijah's prayer was immediate, dramatic, and absolutely unmistakable. Fire fell from heaven. Not a small flame that gradually grew, not a spark that ignited the wood, not a natural phenomenon that could be explained by meteorology or chemistry. This was supernatural fire, divine fire, holy fire that blazed down from the throne of God himself. And this fire didn't just consume the sacrifice, it didn't just burn up the wood, it consumed everything. The offering was instantly vaporized. The wood disappeared in a flash. The 12 stones that Elijah had so carefully arranged were completely consumed. Even the soil around the altar was burned up. The water in the trench, all those precious gallons that had been poured out, was licked up by the divine flames as if it had never been there. The heat must have been incredible. The light must have been blinding. The sound must have been like thunder echoing across the mountainside. Everyone watching would have felt the power of God in a way that shook them to their very core. This wasn't just a miracle, it was a demonstration of absolute divine authority. God was making a statement that could not be ignored, denied, or explained away. He was declaring to Israel, to the prophets of Baal, to King Ahab and Queen Jezebel, and to everyone watching, that he alone is God, that he alone has power over the elements, and that he alone deserves worship and obedience. Chapter 12. The people's response. When the people saw the fire fall from heaven and consume everything on the altar, their response was immediate and overwhelming. They fell prostrate on the ground, not just kneeling, but face down in the dirt, overwhelmed by the presence and power of the Almighty God. And they cried out in unison, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" Think about what this meant. Many of these same people had been worshipping Baal just hours before. They had been convinced that the storm god was real and powerful. They had invested their hopes, their prayers, and their sacrifices in a false deity. But now, confronted with undeniable evidence of God's power, they acknowledged the truth they had been running from for 3 years. This wasn't just an intellectual acknowledgement or a polite religious sentiment. This was a deep, heart-level recognition of divine authority. They had seen something that shattered their old beliefs and transformed their understanding of spiritual reality. The God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, the God their fathers had worshipped. He was the true God, and all other gods were mere pretenders. The cry, "The Lord, He is God," became a declaration of faith that echoed across the mountainside and down through the centuries. It was a moment of national awakening, a turning point when an entire people group remembered who they were and whose they were. Chapter 13. Justice and Restoration. But the story didn't end with the people's declaration of faith. God's justice demanded that those who had led the nation astray face the consequences of their deception. Under Elijah's direction, the people seized the 450 prophets of Baal who had spent the day proving the powerlessness of their God. This might seem harsh to our modern sensibilities, but we need to understand the context. These men had been leading an entire nation away from the true God. They had been accomplices in the persecution and murder of God's true prophets. They had been teaching lies in the name of religion, deceiving people who were desperately seeking spiritual truth. Their deception had contributed to the spiritual darkness that had brought God's judgment upon the land. Justice was swift and final. All 450 prophets of Baal were executed, removing the source of false teaching that had poisoned the nation's spiritual life. With the false prophets dealt with and the people's hearts turned back to God, it was time for the next phase of God's plan, the restoration of His blessing upon the land. Chapter 14. The sound of abundant rain. Elijah said to Ahab, "Go, eat and drink, for there is the sound of a heavy rain." This statement is remarkable for several reasons. First, there wasn't a cloud in the sky. The weather conditions were identical to what they had been for 3 years. Hot, dry, and utterly cloudless. But Elijah had the faith to hear the sound of rain that existed only in the promise of God. This is the kind of faith that sees the invisible and hears the inaudible. Elijah wasn't looking at circumstances or relying on weather forecasts. He was trusting in the word of God, who had promised to send rain upon the land. While Ahab went to eat and drink, Elijah climbed to the top of Mount Carmel and threw himself down on the ground in prayer. This wasn't a casual request or a polite religious ritual. This was intense, fervent prayer from a man who understood that he was participating in God's plan to restore his people. 7 times Elijah sent his servant to look toward the sea for signs of rain. 6 times the servant returned with the same report. There is nothing there. But Elijah didn't give up. He didn't doubt God's promise or question his own faith. He kept praying, kept believing, kept expecting God to fulfill his word. On the 7th time, the servant returned with different news. A cloud as small as a man's hand is rising from the sea. To most people, a tiny cloud on the horizon wouldn't seem significant, especially after 3 years of drought. But to the eyes of faith, that small cloud was the beginning of God's abundant provision. Elijah immediately told his servant to run to Ahab with this message: "Hitch up your chariot and go down before the rain stops you." Chapter 15. The Storm of Restoration. What followed was one of the most dramatic weather changes in recorded history. The tiny cloud that had appeared on the horizon quickly grew and multiplied. The sky, which had been clear blue for 3 years, suddenly turned black with storm clouds. The wind began to blow with increasing intensity, and then the rain began to fall. But this wasn't a gentle shower or a light drizzle. This was a torrential downpour, a deluge that made up for 3 years of drought in a matter of hours. The rain came down in sheets so heavy that visibility was reduced to just a few feet. The ground, which had been hard as concrete from years of drought, couldn't absorb the water fast enough, and soon rivers of rainwater were flowing down every hillside and through every valley. It was as if God was saying, "You thought I had forgotten how to send rain? You believed that Baal was the god of storms? Let me show you what real divine power looks like." The storm was so intense that King Ahab, travelling in his royal chariot, had difficulty making the journey back to his palace in Jezreel. But here's one of the most amazing details of the entire story. The power of the Lord came on Elijah, and tucking his cloak into his belt, he ran ahead of Ahab's chariot all the way to Jezreel. Picture this scene. A middle-aged prophet who had just spent an entire day in intense spiritual warfare, who had just called down fire from heaven and orchestrated the execution of 450 false prophets who had just prayed intensely for rain. This same man was given supernatural strength to outrun a horse-drawn chariot for about 17 miles through a driving rainstorm. This wasn't natural human endurance. This was divine empowerment, God's way of putting an exclamation point on the entire day's events. Even in the storm, even in the exhaustion that should have followed such an intense spiritual battle, God's power was sufficient to carry his faithful servant. Chapter 16. Lessons for today. The story of Elijah on Mount Carmel is far more than just an exciting historical account. It's a template for understanding how God works in our world today and how he calls each of us to live lives of faith and courage. First, we see the power of standing alone for truth. Elijah was outnumbered 450 to 1, but he wasn't really alone because God was with him. In our culture today, it often feels like those who stand for biblical truth are vastly outnumbered by those who have embraced the false gods of our age. materialism, relativism, hedonism, and secular humanism. But numbers don't determine truth, and God's power isn't limited by human statistics. Second, we learn that false gods will always disappoint. The prophets of Baal cried out to their God from morning until evening, but he never answered because he wasn't real. Today's false gods, money, success, pleasure, power, technology, entertainment, promise fulfillment, but can never deliver on their promises. Only the true God can satisfy the deepest longings of the human heart. Third, we see that God often chooses to work through ordinary people who have extraordinary faith. Elijah wasn't from a prominent family or an influential background. He was just a man who believed God and was willing to stake everything on that belief. God is still looking for such people today, men and women who will trust him completely and obey him fully, regardless of the circumstances or the opposition. Fourth, we learn the importance of prayer in the life of faith. Elijah's prayer was simple but powerful because it was offered in complete faith and alignment with God's will. He wasn't trying to manipulate God or impress people. He was simply communicating with his heavenly Father and trusting him to act according to his promises. Fifth, we see that God's miracles often come after periods of preparation and testing. The 3 years of drought weren't just punishment for sin, they were preparation for a miracle. God was setting the stage for a demonstration of his power that would be undeniable and unforgettable. Sometimes what looks like delay in our lives is actually divine preparation for something greater than we could imagine. Conclusion. Where is your Mount Carmel? As we conclude this incredible story, I want to ask you a personal question. Where is your Mount Carmel? What situation in your life is calling for a clear demonstration of God's power and faithfulness? What false gods have you been trusting instead of the one true God? What impossible circumstance are you facing that only divine intervention can resolve? Maybe you're facing a financial crisis that seems hopeless and you need God to provide for your needs in supernatural ways. Perhaps you're dealing with a health challenge that has left doctors puzzled, and you need the great physician to demonstrate his healing power. It could be that you're struggling with a relationship that seems beyond repair, and you need the God of restoration to work a miracle in your marriage or family. Or maybe your Mount Carmel is more internal. Maybe you've been worshipping the false gods of success, approval, comfort, or control, and you need to experience the reality of God's presence and power in a fresh way. Maybe you've been trying to live the Christian life in your own strength, and you need to discover what it means to depend completely on God's power rather than your own abilities. The same God who answered Elijah's prayer with fire from heaven is still on the throne today. He still hears the prayers of his people. He still demonstrates his power in impossible situations. He still turns hearts back to himself and brings restoration where there has been devastation. But like Elijah, we must be willing to stake everything on God's faithfulness. We must be prepared to stand alone if necessary, to trust when circumstances seem impossible, to pray with faith rather than doubt, and to give God the opportunity to show his power in ways that will leave no doubt about his reality and love. The fire that fell on Mount Carmel that day wasn't just about proving that the Lord is God, though it certainly did that. It was about a loving father reaching out to his wayward children, demonstrating his power not to destroy them but to draw them back to himself. It was about restoration, redemption, and the kind of love that will go to any lengths to rescue those who are precious to him. That same love is reaching out to you today. That same power is available to you in your situation. That same God who answered Elijah is waiting to answer your prayers and demonstrate His faithfulness in your life. The question isn't whether God is able. The question is whether you're willing to trust Him completely, to step out in faith even when the odds seem impossible, and to give Him the opportunity to show His power in your Mount Carmel moment. So I challenge you today, don't settle for the false gods of our culture. Don't be satisfied with a powerless religion that looks good on the surface, but lacks the reality of divine presence. Cry out like the people on Mount Carmel, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." And then watch as the fire of His presence transforms your impossible situation into a testimony of His faithfulness and power. The same God who sent fire from heaven is ready to move in your life today. Are you ready to trust Him completely and see what He will do? Remember to subscribe to Sacred Rest for more life-changing messages like this one. Until next time, may you know the reality of God's presence and power in every area of your life. God bless you.